Hi, John. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you.
Can you see me?
No.
Okay. 1 second. There we go. Can you see me
Oh,
now?
yes. All I could
Good.
see was a big fist.
Yeah, yeah. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too. How are things in London?
Things in London are kind of quietish generally, I think. Yeah, things with me are a little hectic, but that's another story.
Things with you are a
Is
little
the aud?
hectic.
Yeah, yeah. Just juggling a lot at the moment. Um, is the audio fine with these?
Yeah, it's fine. Can you hear me all right?
Good. I can hear you perfectly fine. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so now for someone listening, I'm talking to Miriam Escofet in London. Now, did I pronounce that right? Do I pronounce the T or not?
Perfectly, perfectly. Very unusually, yes, you do pronounce the T. That's 10 out of 10 there, John.
Okay,
It's a
well,
rarity.
I have Dina Brodsky to thank for that. I listened to your chat with her on the Art Grind, and she pronounced it like that, but I just thought I'd check.
Yeah. No, that's perfect.
Very good. Now, and just to give you time context for our conversation, today is Wednesday, the 1st of September, 2021. Did we ever think we'd get to the 1st of September, 2021? Wow.
Mm. Where's the summer gone?
Yeah, but just with everything that's happened, like it seems like it sort of feels like we've been in spring or March, or the whole idea of getting to this end of the year, the autumn end of the year, just seemed like so far away. To me, anyway, for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think our whole relationship with time has been slightly messed around with, but, I think as artists, we're slightly used to that anyway, because we live in a slightly different space-time continuum, I think, most of the time,
Space-time continuum. Very good. I like that. Now, we've had lots of questions come in on social media, so we'll get into them. Adrian in London says, what 3 or 4 adjectives would you yourself use to best describe your very distinctive and instantly recognizable visual world?
Yes, gosh, I read that question. I should have given it some thought, because now I'm sort of. I think it's really hard to describe your own work. I actually think it's really hard to ascribe adjectives to art, but we have to. I think my work is classical and slightly surreal at the same time. I think probably I've heard people describe it as having a touch of magic realism, which is probably a slightly better description than kind of surreal. And I think it's quite allegorical. So I'll go with those: classical, magic realism, allegorical.
Very
There's
good.
100 of other things. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear you say surreal, because I was kind of looking at them going, yeah, this is kind of arriving with me as kind of surrealist. So that's good. I'm glad you think so too.
Good.
Yeah. So just to put your sensibilities in context, who are your creative heroes? Are they all artists? Are they all painters?
Most of them are painters, but not exclusively. In the painting world, I look at a lot of kind of Renaissance, especially early Renaissance art, late kind of Gothic, around the kind of invention of oil painting, the invention of perspective. I think it's a period that I find really fascinating. I have looked at a lot of archaic art as well. I was really very interested in architecture for a long time. And I looked at a lot of kind of temple architecture. I actually studied 3D design and worked with clay when I left art school. So that whole kind of 3-dimensionality kind of construction design element, which I still think is very much part of my painting work, was obviously very much at the fore then. So I've looked at a lot of architectural drawings I'm fascinated by. I can get quite inspired by music as well. I love film. I'm quite inspired by film. I'm not sure that there's a direct reference between film and my work. In fact, I know there isn't. But there's a lot of imagery in film that I see that I kind of, triggers ideas, and just find sort of very inspiring. So, gosh, if I'm trying to think of film directors, God, so many. I'm a particular fan of Ridley Scott's movies. I think precisely because he is such a visual director, and I think the sense of the kind of the visual wow factor is always such a huge part of his films. And so, I don't think all his films are perfect by any means, and some of them are hugely commercial, and other ones are actually far more interesting in terms of their narrative. But visually, they always deliver. So I kind of appreciate that. I really like Terrence Malick, I think his name is, the one that does the kind of almost non-linear, non-verbal kind of films. And again, because the kind of...
they're very verbal. Hang on a minute. I was saying this. This like the first Terrence Malick film I watched, I liked it, and it had the internal monologue, and it was like, I think it was the Thin Red Line. I was like, that's fantastic. But then every other film that he does has got this internal monologue. It just drives me nuts now.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the time they're kind of there's a heavy. Gosh, if he's listening, which of course he won't be, excuse me, because I do think he's a genius. But there's a heavy sense of pretentiousness about a lot of what he does. But that's okay, that's okay, because I think he's somebody. I mean, his films are so kind of unusual, and he takes risks. And I think visually they're really, really fascinating. And I think it's the sense of time, the sense. We're so used to films being delivered in a certain way, where there's a kind of very strong narrative structure, and it takes you through at a pace. Most films deliver the storyline at a certain pace, and we're kind of brainwashed. We're used to digesting that kind of information, and suddenly you're sitting in front of a Terrence Malick film. You don't quite understand what timeline you're in. You just have to go with the flow. And so then it becomes a real experience. And I think that's what's so powerful about his films, and they're just beautifully made. So anyway, enough about him. Anyway,
he'll be emailing me about that pretentious comment, I can tell you. He's always emailing me. Yeah, regular listener. I just want to go back to something you said earlier on about 3D design. What is that?
Good question. I mean, it was the most clunkily titled art course I've ever come across. It was called 3D Design WMCP, which stood for Wood, Metal, Ceramics and Plastics. So I did a foundation course here, which not everybody does, but it's not an unusual thing. And it's basically when you leave school and you decide you want to go to art school, and it's a kind of interim course that you do for a year. And you do a bit of everything. You do a bit of, it's when most people get familiar with kind of drawing and, just doing anything seriously artistic of any kind. And it's supposed to be a window of time within which you discover which kind of avenue of art you want to take. And I knew that I knew very strongly that I wanted to do fine art, and I wasn't sure whether it was going to be sculpture or painting. And of course, like with everything in education, you have to choose. Everything's so kind of narrowed down. So I had to choose one or the other. And I went off and had a look at the kind of main art schools that I could think of at the time, just to have a look at fine art courses. And they were all so deeply conceptual. It was the kind of late 80s when that kind of whole conceptual philosophy had completely taken over pretty much all art schools here. And I just knew that I just didn't want to put myself through 3 years of that. So I kind of went back to my foundation course teachers feeling kind of really depressed by what I'd seen. And one of them suggested I should do a 3D design course because it's a skills-based course. You make stuff, you make things. You can take it in many different directions. It can be design in a very fine arty kind of way, or it can be design in a very kind of industrial prototype kind of way, And there were only 2 courses in the country. One was in Brighton and one was in Wolverhampton. So I went to Brighton for 3 years. And I mean, I wouldn't say it was an amazing, and again, if Brighton School of Art are listening, apologies. I wouldn't say it was an amazing art course, but I don't think any art courses at the time, I'm not sure even any art courses now are amazing. I think art school is one of those very strange environments where you make of it what you will, but actually what's kind of delivered to you by you, it was a very mixed bag of very kind of confused kind of ethos about what art was. And I think art schools got it into their head that they would teach people how to be artists and sod the skills. And that permeated pretty much. It was, with some art courses, it was harder to deploy that philosophy because a 3D design course, you have to make 3D stuff, even though actually some students on my course got through 3 years without making very much because they kind of conceptualized the whole process. And so even there, that whole kind of philosophy had sort of, infiltrated its way into the course. But that's why I end up, it wasn't a choice that I made. It was a kind of default choice that I was left with because what I was looking for didn't exist, or at least I didn't know where to find it. I didn't know about places like the Florence Academy and, all this kind of, I'm not even sure, I don't even know if the Florence Academy was actually up and running then. I think it probably was that it's kind of, I don't know when it opened, but anyway.
In one room with 3 people.
Exactly. And, we were all going off to art school on a grant then. I think mine was the last year where I think the kind of tuition fees came in after I left art school. So there's no way I could have afforded to, take myself off to Florence and, treat myself to 3 years at the Florence Academy. That would not have been an option for me anyway. So anyway, that's why I sort of did 3D design. And then I sort of, I really loved working with clay. Clay is such a sculptural material. Anyway, it's one of the kind of fundamental materials for any artist, I think. And I worked in clay for a few years after I left art school. And then I started painting after I left art school as well. And that sort of gradually took over. But that whole kind of making is very much still part of my painting process. Actually, I think of my paintings as very constructed in a way, both in terms of their design, sometimes in terms of their content, but also in terms of how I just the painting process, because I paint in a lot of layers. I use a lot of glazes, and I overindulge that process now because I feel that I really know what I'm doing now with it. I mean, at first it was just, for a few years, it was just a kind of process of discovery, which was very exciting. And then once I kind of understood what I was doing with the paint, then I sort of almost made it more evolved than it needs to be because I love the process so much. And I love that kind of whole magic that you can create between one paint layer and another. So yeah, that's kind of a process of construction when you think about it. In my mind anyway. Yeah,
it's funny, like you couldn't get away with calling a course that now without people just immediately assuming it was a 3D graphics kind of course,
Yeah.
And
I mean, we weren't even sending emails when I was at art school. It was a different world. The digital world did not exist. You had to physically go and find books and go to exhibitions, and it's amazing how the world has changed in that sense.
Yeah. And when you're talking about wanting to go to, or wishing there was something like the Florence Academy, like you had the sort of artistic upbringing that probably most artists fantasize about. I'm guessing they would anyway, because your mum and your dad were both artists, and there was nothing but art books and art talk and art, more importantly, above everything, art appreciation. Through your whole
childhood. I realized absolutely I realized that was I was very blessed in that sense. And I think also that's probably why I could so confidently discern what was right for me and what wasn't right for me when I was approaching art schools. I could have a look and say, actually, this is crap. And I'm not going to, they can take it seriously if they like. I know it's crap. And I could feel that very confidently inside of me, and no one was going to, and that it wasn't that I was being blinkered about it. It's just that I felt I could navigate what had value and what didn't, and it's because I had been brought up in this very this very kind of artistic environment, and I've been looking at art since before I could talk, so I often say that one of my earliest memories of childhood is actually my father had his art books very much at floor level, which was incredibly lucky for us. It was a design aspect for him in the living room, but for us it was a gift. So my brother and my brother's only a year older than me, I remember we'd kind of crawl to this shelf and whip out these huge kind of tomes, and there'd be, a book on Bosch, a book on Mantegna, a book on Bellini. And we would just leaf through these images like with this incredible sense of just wonder. And that's the thing. I think that for me, ultimately, that the fact that art has to fill you with some kind of sense of wonder, for me, is a really fundamental idea. And if it doesn't do that, it has failed. That's my own sort of take on it. And that comes very much from that age, because that was my first reaction to seeing these kind of wondrous images, was that I didn't understand them. I knew there was a language there that I couldn't decipher, and that made it all the more kind of mysterious and appealing. Even at the age of 2 or 3, I sort of got that. But I just wanted to get lost in them. I just wanted to just kind of be swept into these, even Bosch's kind of depictions of hell, which are really quite gruesome, but they were just kind of deeply fascinating.
God, I was traumatized by them as a kid. I can still remember.
I don't know why. I mean, they were horrific, but they were horrific in a deeply fascinating way, because it was that sense of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's that sense of, it's the seduction that happens in those artworks. They're so compelling. Their reality becomes real to you. When you stand in front of these artworks, you're temporarily taken into their psychotic, psychedelic, beautiful, whatever it might be. You're kind of taken into their worlds. Yeah. And I think that's what I always look for in art. I always look for that kind of power, really, to really kind of take me over.
So what kind of artists are you enjoying, like contemporary artists, working artists, are you enjoying at the moment?
So quite a few. I'm really, really rubbish at remembering names. But anyway, yes, I can. So I've recently reconnected a little bit with. So I was born in Spain, and we moved to the UK when I was 12, and so all my career has developed in the UK, and I've exhibited quite a bit in Paris, and it's only in the last few years that I've kind of reconnected with Spain as a place, through my work, through the Mayhem Museum there. And that's been a real joy for me, just on a personal level, because it just feels very nice to show my work in my city of birth, in Barcelona. But also because I think that Spanish artists are, when they're good, they are incredible painters, especially in the figurative realm. So I've seen a lot of really amazing figurative painters that I just wasn't even aware were there. Because they've been shown in exhibitions that I've been part of, or, because they're part of the kind of collection of the Mayhem and whatever. And I'm not going to name just a few, because there's many of them. I just don't want to pick 2 names because they happen to be the ones that I remember, because it means that I'm editing the others out. But if you have a look at the Mayhem website and have a look at their permanent collection, you'll see a lot of really incredible figurative work there. And there's an Italian artist I find really fascinating. His name is Agostino Arribabene, and he does this kind of mish technique paintings, which is basically using a mixture of tempera and oil painting. And they have a really kind of a real Renaissance quality about them, but not in a pseudo kind of historicist pastiche kind of way, which is, you do see that a lot. I mean, I think he literally kind of breathes the spirit of the Renaissance in his work. Again, there's slightly sort of very surreal sometimes, in fact, most of the time, and slightly kind of disturbing, some of them. But technically, I think he's really brilliant. And I think those paintings do that thing that I was saying earlier. They create this kind of world that you just, whether you like it or not, you just can't help but be absolutely immersed in it. And I was lucky enough to see an exhibition of his work in New York. I happened to be in New York a few years back, and just looking at galleries, and there was this gallery, I can't remember the name of it, and they would just happen to be having an exhibition of his work, and I sort of ran in there practically hyperventilating, because I'd only ever seen his work online. And that's the other thing. It's very important to see work in the flesh. And what surprised me was, how massive his paintings were. And I don't know whether this happened to be an exhibition of particularly large work, because I think he also does very small work. But yeah, really fun. And it just reaffirmed for me actually what a great artist he is. They kind of have a real power to them. Obviously, Antonio Lopez Garcia, who's been such a influential painter. I mean, not just in Spain. I mean, I'm so glad to see that the Americans seem to be very aware of him too. And I'm not sure that he's so well known here in the UK. I mean, he is amongst the kind of art community, but not so much, amongst the kind of general public. But I mean, he's an amazing painter. And again, his paintings have real, it's not necessarily that he's the best painter in the world, although he's a fabulous painter. His paintings are so emotionally charged, and there's something very deeply spiritual in his work. And it's almost as much about what he doesn't put into the work as what he puts in. It's what he edits out as much as what he puts in that creates almost like a space of mystery in the work, where you can sort of step in and wonder what's happening behind that plate on the table that hasn't quite been, all that kind of stuff that goes on that's just so fascinating. So I think he's incredible. Plenty others, I'm sure. But anyway, I think that's probably, I'm sure others will crop up in conversation as we get along.
All right. Now I'm probably going to slaughter this. Miriam Escofet in Cuba, right, says that they had it in Spanish, but I asked Google and it translated it for me. It said, "What motivated you painting? God bless you."
Oh, yes. Well, what motivated? Well, I think partly my childhood, inevitably. I mean, it was part of the air that I breathed as I grew up. And
did your siblings become artists as well?
No. I mean, my brother used to draw a lot. In fact, he drew more than I did. I was always kind of fiddling around with bits of cardboard and Stanley knives and bits of sellotape. And he was always doing these incredible drawings. And if you'd kind of watched us as children, you would have assumed that my brother would have been the one that would have, but then he got very interested in history and politics and went off and studied history and politics. And actually, I was very interested in sciences at school and mathematics, but it was a very last minute decision that made me think, God, the obvious path for me would have been to have gone to university and study physics. That was my favorite subject. And again, it's one of those very clear memories that I have, and it's very kind of non-verbal, but I remember, I think it was during the last year of my A-levels when you're kind of all making these decisions about, what you do next. And I remember thinking, I could go and study physics, and I could, and I saw my life sort of doing this, like a tunnel, a very precise, narrow, beautiful tunnel kind of ahead of me, like that, like a sort of narrowing. And then I thought, and it was like a visual image that I got. And I thought, actually, I don't want that life. I want a life that's like this. And I want a life that's expansive and expressive. And it's not always saying 2 and 2 equals 4. Sometimes 2 and 2 might equal 5. I just wanted something a bit more. And so I thought, I'll just go to art school. And that was the full extent of my kind of rational thought process behind
so
the
how did
idea
that work out for you?
Well, as I was saying earlier, art school was a,
No, I mean, did your life go in the expansive way you hoped?
Yes, it did actually. But I mean, as anybody who's an artist knows, it's not an easy life. From the outside, it can look very romantic being an artist, but you have to dig really deep to be an artist and to stay on that path, or with any degree of seriousness. So it's not an easy path to tread, and it really isn't for everybody. So yes, it's been. I wouldn't swap it. I wouldn't choose to have done something else. But that's not to say that it hasn't come without challenges, because it certainly has, and it still does. I mean, I think every day of being an artist brings its own challenge. But yes, what I've been able to do as an artist, and it's come. It didn't all happen at once. It's kind of, because you have to, you spend half your life as an artist, in a sense, finding out what kind of artist you're going to be, or finding out what you're really about. Once you've filtered out all the kind of influences, and once you've filtered out all the ideas of, I want to paint like this, and I want to paint like that, and I want to be like him, and I want to be like her, and this is what I'd like, once all of that's kind of, and you start to really kind of just listen to yourself. What you've fed all of that into your system, and then you start to listen to yourself, and you start to filter out. And that's when, for me, I just thought that I brought so much of that kind of, in a sense, scientific thinking and logical thinking, which is what I really loved about sciences and maths. I brought that into my work, and in fact, I did that kind of from the beginning, but I did it more and more consciously and more confidently as I sort of developed as an artist. And so a lot of the times there's a real synthesis of thought processes going on when I sort of work out a painting. And that I find really, really deeply exciting. And I think there's a very narrow, I think there's creativity is not just the realm of artists. Creativity happens obviously in all sorts of different fields. And I think you could be, you could be an astronomer, or you could be so you're tapping into that sort of, there's as much creativity, I think, in kind of cutting edge science as there is in the arts. It's just expressed in a different language, and it's just following different kind of logical pathways, really, to get to kind of solutions and answers and ideas. It's all about ideas. So, yeah.
Well, there's that famous story about Einstein when they asked him how did he come up with the theory for light, something or other, light speed or something, and he was talking about how I think he was semi-dreaming and could see himself sliding down a rainbow or a moonbeam or something like that. Very visually kind of creative image, and then it was like, and then off to the blackboard with the equations and put it into that language. Yeah. So do you still like physics? Are you still interested in it?
I do. I mean, I don't follow it, and I don't. But I'm fascinated by scientific ideas. Because I think that they're kind of exploring. Well, they're kind of exploring the meaning of life, really. And that's just a really, or the why we're here, or why we got here, or. The thing that I sort of, there's a tendency in science to think that they have kind of found the answer to everything. That science, so my take on it, and again, this is my kind of very third degree philosophy, but science is a logic that works in and of itself. It's like mathematics. So if you stay within that grid, you can find the solutions and the answers to everything. But that does not mean that there's an alternative way of looking at the universe and everything in it that maybe our brains can't even encapsulate that might have an equally plausible but different. So, science is a logic system that's amazing, but that's kind of all it is. And I think when science gets kind of very pompous and big for its boots and thinks that it has completely explained to us the Big Bang and everything that's going to happen in 3 billion years' time, I always think, really? Okay, so a bit more humility in some scientific research or conclusions or kind of thinking would be, and I think that's the bit that I struggled with when I was at school. So it was the kind of certainty of it, or the inherent certainty that the kind of thought processes imply, that it's kind of, that's what didn't sit very well with me.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. I've probably kind of garbled that completely, but
no, it didn't. I know what you mean, because it's a weird kind of thing. I think it's the human part of it, because, if you take the human bit out of it, it's like, well, science is, the pursuit of knowledge, and as new information comes to light, then we change the working model of what we think everything is, and then more new information appears, and then you change it again. So to kind of go, no, this is the way it is, it kind of forgets that bit that, like, well, tomorrow there might be new information and we'll have to throw that one out and, come up with a new one.
Yeah.
Okay. So how does the idea for a painting start for you?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. That's really like asking what the meaning of life is.
Okay, well, I'll make it a bit easier for you then, right?
Yeah, go on.
Like, well, how do you record your ideas? Like, are you a sketchbook person?
Yeah.
Do you write stuff down? Do you, what are the other things? Do you make little voice memos, Like how, because it's all in the ether, I know, but we all have ways of capturing the little snippets,
Yeah. So yes, I do use sketchbooks, probably not as much as other artists do. I often write ideas down. So I like to use language to describe ideas sometimes. And I can do that around a sketch as well. So a sketch can often include whatever drawing element there is and written element too. I don't do voice memos. I hadn't even thought of that, but that's an interesting idea. Like all of us, I capture things, with my iPhone or with photography. I see something somewhere, and the problem with that is that you capture it and then you forget. It just goes into that bottomless pit that's the kind of photo bank on your phone, and you tend not to look at it again. So it's actually, although we all do it, and we do it quite bulimically, it's not actually the best way to gather information, weirdly. So I think that, I think the beauty of sketching something down or writing something down is that you've already done that very embryonic first step of synthesizing what it is about what you've seen or thought of, what the essence of that is that's actually triggered something.
Yeah.
So that's a very valid thing to do. I mean, I think because my paintings are so kind of time consuming to paint, because they're so detailed and they're so involved in the process and whatever, I don't produce an awful lot of work a year. So in a sense, I'm not having to come up with a zillion and one ideas to produce a body of work. Often I've got the opposite problem, that I've got a lot of ideas that are sort of sitting on the back burner, and they're kind of desperate to come out, and I don't have playground space to let them come out and play and kind of morph into whatever they're going to morph into.
Playground
and I'm
space.
They just kind of so I'm always very aware that there are these kind of ideas that are sort of kind of swimming around at the back of my head, and when a project comes along, I sort of have a moment when I think, might this be the right opportunity to bring one of these out and see how they'll work within this context or within this, whatever. So, I mean, I have sketchbooks full of kind of visual references, bits of collage, bits pasted all over the place, things written down, that sadly, probably most of that will never find expression. I mean, I feel like crying even as I say that, because I get very excited when I write these things down. But I realize how long it takes me to kind of create work. But somehow, sometimes they morph. Ideas are kind of they're almost like living entities in a weird way. So they have their own life paths. So you'll have had an idea. Sometimes I can be carrying an idea that I've had for 10 years or more. And by the time it does find expression, it kind of doesn't want to be that idea that I had 10 years ago. It has its own, it's almost like it's got its own personality, and it comes through as something slightly different. So there'll be the DNA root of that. But by the time it comes through on the canvas in whichever way, it could just be a tiny detail in a painting, or it could be just a very fundamental part of the composition. It's become something else, but it's become its own thing. And I think that comes a bit with maturity, is that you become less rigid about that. I think when I was younger, I was very kind of fundamentalist about, no, this is what I thought. This is the idea I had when I set out, and it's gonna be like this, come what may. And now I think that work just is much more interesting, but much more successful if you let ideas settle into what they want to be, And often, if you don't try to put so many ideas in one painting, that's something I used to do a lot years ago, that I felt I had so many ideas and I wanted to cram a lot of them into a work, and they often became too busy, I think, the paintings, or too show-offy, which is probably even worse. And now I think it's kind of less is more, not aesthetically, but just in terms of what the painting's going to communicate, or what people are going to get from looking at the work. So okay. What was the... Did that answer the question? I can't even... What was the question?
Yep. It was, how does the idea for painting start? Yeah. Cynthia Cabrera in Canada says, I'd love to know how you get your references and work out complex scenes in the photo, a collage, in a drawing, or digitally. Thank you so much in advance. And Denise Rosary Melvin in Florence says, I'd like to know more about your composition process. How do you develop the initial idea into a complex painting? Also, do you use photos and software such as Photoshop? So both, they're kind of the same. Yeah, no, good questions. Yes, I do use photography as reference a lot. And yes, I do use Photoshop in a very crude way to move elements around. I use Photoshop if I'm working on a very complex composition. And that often will be, sometimes with portraits as well, when there's a real kind of element of background around the person, or there's a lot of elements in the painting at the initial stages when I'm trying to work out which version of the possible compositions would work better. Photoshop is very useful because you can literally move that object from the left side to the right-hand side. You can move the chair over here, you can move the table over there. And so very quickly, you can just get a sense of the harmony of the painting, and what will work and what won't work. But very quickly, once I've done that, very quickly I move away from that, and I try to resolve. Always try to do a layout drawing for paintings. Maybe not all paintings, but most paintings, I will try to do quite an evolved layout drawing. And that's because I love drawing. My paintings take forever. So it's like a little window of time that I get between paintings where I get to draw, which I really love. And I try to, before, the layout drawings were very much just layout drawings, and some of them were literally just like line drawings, almost like sort of draft drawings, really. And sometimes on tracing paper, because I would work on several layers, especially for paintings that had a lot of architectural complexity to it. So I would start off with the kind of structure of the painting, and then again I would sort of
draw an object, and that would allow me to move the object around on top of it's almost like a sort of architectural process, really, in a weird kind of way.
And would they be to the scale of the finished painting?
There would be the scale, because then they would then get traced onto the canvas.
Right. Yeah.
And some of these drawings are not very beautiful by any means, but I've kept them all because to me they're kind of really precious. Because it's the kind of germ of the idea, and it's actually it's the stage of painting that I love the most, is resolving composition. I find it really, really creative, because there's a lot about the painting process that's can be quite ploddy if we're honest. There's moments of magic in painting, but a lot of the painting sometimes it's just putting the paint on the canvas and filling spaces in with color and shadow, and a lot of that can feel quite monotonous as you're doing it. But when you're working out the composition, your brain is literally frying. It's on 180 degrees, because you're kind of, there's so much to consider, and there's such fine judgments that you can make about everything, and that to me feels very exciting. But now what I try to do is I try to make these layout drawings quite sort of polished in a way. Awful word, but I try to evolve them into more of for drawing in their own right, because going back to, I love drawing, but also sometimes they're pieces that I can then also exhibit in exhibitions, because I'm always short of work to put into open exhibitions, because again, I don't produce that many oil paintings. And also when paintings are commissioned, it's not, you don't always have the chance to exhibit them. So it's a nice way of almost building up a little body of work for myself, that's mine, that I can sort of, so yeah, that's very much part of the working process. And in terms of kind of how I work the composition out, and obviously that's obviously very tied to the ideas. So whatever the idea might be, there's a real, there can be a real evolution in that stage. And often with pretty much all my work, when I think about it, even the portraits that are actually quite organic, the first stage is actually working out the composition of the space in the painting. Actually, that might not be the first stage. The first stage might be, I want a teacup here, I want a pot, I want this, and your hand here, please, and all of that. But then once I've got a sense of the harmony of the pose or whatever it is that I'm after, I'll then get very obsessive about constructing that space before any of those elements can inhabit it. And again, I think it's just the way my mind works. I'm very obsessed with the sense of space in a painting. And it goes back to this fascination with kind of 3D and design and object. I love objects. Yeah. So the space between the objects is as important to me as the objects themselves. And so that's kind of, that's very important. And once I've resolved that, and sometimes that can be a very evolved kind of perspectival space drawing, almost like a floor grid drawing. Or sometimes it can literally be as simple as just finding the horizon and the vanishing point and just having that as a quick reference, and maybe a couple of lateral vanishing points. It can be very complex or very simple. But once I've done that then gives me the structure within which I can kind of move the elements around. So so drawing, a bit of Photoshop work, kind of evolved layout drawings within which I also explore the mood of the painting a little bit. And photographic references are very useful. We all use them. You have to be careful. I'm very confident about using photographs because I've spent many years painting my very weird kind of still life paintings, which were all painted from life, except there'd always be one or two invented objects in those paintings, And so when I look at a photograph now, and normally it's a photograph that I've taken myself, I can decipher that information quite confidently. I think there are many artists out there that have probably started working from photographs from the off when they started painting. And I think it's almost like the photograph has ended up dictating to them what information is going to be on the canvas. And you can see that. You can see the difference between artists that have only predominantly used photographic references. And some of them actually can do very interesting stuff with it, because that can become a launch pad from which they do something very interesting.
Yeah.
But sometimes not. So sometimes that can be to the detriment of the work. So I think photography is incredibly useful, but you have to be really careful who's the boss when you're using photographs in the work. Do you know what I mean? You know, the photography is there to serve you. It's a tool, and it's so seductive because people fall in love with the photographic image because it is amazing. The photographic image is amazing, and so they then want to just. If you're not careful, you kind of want to copy everything that photograph is telling you, you know, and you see paintings that are kind of out of focus where the photograph would have been out of focus, and in focus where the photograph would have been in focus, and the glares that the camera got. And none of that is actual organic visual information, it's photographic information. So, you know, there's a fine line, I think, that you have to tread quite carefully as an artist. Unless that's your thing and that you want to kind of surrender to that completely, in which case it's totally fine.
So do you get models in for the for a photo shoot to execute an idea, or how does that end of it work for you?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm doing a portrait, I will definitely, I will draw and I will take a zillion photographs of the sitter. I have to take my own photographs, and I have to control the lighting very carefully. Again, I feel that I know what information I need from that photograph to be able to work from it. And it will never be just one pose. I will take photographs from not radically different poses, because then that becomes totally confusing, but from slightly different angles. Yeah. All of that, so that I have as much information as possible. And I feel that I'm never just reliant on one image to represent that person. You know, I find most people don't really have the time to sit for you. And again, because I am such a kind of hyper detailed painter, you know, if somebody had to sit for me realistically for a portrait, they'd have to give up months of their life, which is it's just not going to work in today's world. I do occasionally, you know, go and draw from the model, and so but that becomes an exercise in its own right, which I love to do, and that's an opportunity for me to it's kind of keeping your hand in as an artist, but it's also an opportunity for me to indulge in drawing, which I love, but also to do something a bit more kind of abstracted with the figure. Yeah, but I don't get models in the way that other artists do. I use people that I know as models predominantly, but I know some artists, it's amazing. They just get models in and they have professional photographers that take photographs for them, and it's all kind of very Hollywood and very high end, and then from those images they create the painting, which seems amazing, but unnecessarily kind of unnecessarily high production value, really, just to get an image to work with, you know, to my mind anyway.
Yeah. And then with what you do on Photoshop, is that just like you figure it out on Photoshop and then you take that information and it informs your drawings, or do you work from the composite image that you've put together on Photoshop?
No, I tend to use Photoshop really, as I said earlier, just to move elements around quickly. It's almost like a time-saving device. And you know, you can you can make the background a little darker, a little lighter. You can play around a little bit of that. But no, I tend to, as I say, from Photoshop, I then quickly move onto the layout drawings.
Onto the drawings, yeah.
Yeah, and I tend to, because now these layout drawings have become quite involved, I get a very strong idea of the kind of mood of the painting from those layout drawings. So they're always there as a kind of aide-memoire, really, is sort of where I want the painting to go. But then I go back to the original photographic material as reference for the
Yeah.
painting.
Yeah.
And often there's invented elements in the painting that don't actually exist in real life. And that I find really fun, because I kind of, I have to sort of invent. Then it falls more into a kind of design aspect of the painting, which I also really enjoy. So, for example, just to give you a clear example of that, so that could be literally the background of a portrait. It could be a kind of wallpaper that might be based on an idea of a certain type of wallpaper, but I'll have actually designed my own wallpaper and designed the color scheme and all of that. So that's a completely invented element in the painting.
Yeah. Right.
Often it can be objects that have been invented simply because I don't physically have those objects with me. And so that I find really fun as well, because it's kind of, I'm constructing the object virtually.
Yeah.
And then making it representationally convincing in the painting. That's its own challenge. That can be rather fun. So I think I think for me, the more creative and the more playful the kind of compositional stage becomes, the more engaged I get with the work. And I find that going through all those processes, within all of those processes, there's always a little door that can open into a shift in an idea or a new idea that you wouldn't have had if you hadn't gone through all those kind of iterations of the idea, as it were. So again, it's something that I've learned, that if I make the journey from idea to design of the painting, which is what we call composition, if I make that quite convoluted, and instead of just going a straight line from A to B, it becomes a little meander around a labyrinth, that where a lot of the turns might be dead ends that go nowhere. But if you're willing to put that time into it and let it become quite playful, it just actually opens up many more possibilities, many more ideas can fall into the painting that way that you would not have envisioned. So that's partly why I do it too, because it just, that happens. And it's a real joy when that happens, because I think as artists, we all like to feel that element of divine intervention, whether you believe in God or not, but creative divine intervention that can crash into your work. It's actually quite an exciting feeling, because otherwise it feels like you're kind of, you're pushing the Titanic up the hill by yourself all the time. That can feel quite, so it kind of feels quite inspiring when that happens, it's it's
like
nice.
having someone big on your side.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mikhail Kremeninsky on Patreon. Thanks for the tea. Mikhail says, I'd love to know more about your process, as I can see there are color pencils involved. Is it mostly about the final piece accuracy that the drawing will help with, or is it some kind of underlayer? How does the oil paint work with the pencils layer? Is it safe? Will it stick together forever?
Yeah, I often get asked this on my Instagram feed, and I think sometimes when I post these drawings that I do that are sometimes the layout drawings, I think because they're quite involved, people think that it's a kind of underpainting stage upon which I then apply the oil paint. It's not at all. They're two separate entities. So there's the drawing and there's the painting. And so, yes, they're linked because they are part of the exploring the idea for the same work, but they're physically two separate bits of work, and intentionally so. So I don't do any evolved drawing like that under the painting. The most that I will do is a line drawing, and that can literally be tracing the layout drawing onto the canvas or scaling it up, or however it works. It can be different for each work. But the most I'll have is a very detailed and precise line drawing on the panel. And I always work on panels that I prepare myself. And I prepare them with a grey gesso ground, and it's kind of like a battleship grey, very unexciting, but it's just a brilliant mid-tone to start the painting on. So often this underline that I have on my panel is white instead of what you would assume it would be, which would be graphite or a dark line of some sort. And the white on the grey gesso is got a really lovely quality. It kind of really pings out. It's very alive. So that's lovely too. And I can wipe it off easily, and then I can just sort of move things around and change them a bit, because again, it's part of that. I never allow a stage to pass in front of me without feeling that I can sort of tweak it a little bit. You know, I like that. I like the fact that, so when I've transposed the drawing that looks perfect on the layout drawing, when I've transposed that onto the panel, then there's an opportunity to actually change it a little bit again, because on the panel it will always look different to the way it does on the paper for some reason, even though it will be the same size, and it just kind of breathes differently, you know. Yeah. And then I start to paint. I don't really do a grisaille underpainting, which a lot of people assume that I do. I actually start to paint with quite a reduced sort of palette, a very simple palette. But I start to do a kind of 3-tone modulation of most parts of the painting. And I evolve that to quite a refined level. And then I start to apply glazes on top of that, selectively in parts of the painting. I mean, obviously in the backgrounds were just born to be glazed over, because you can tweak, you can make it darker and darker and lighter, and you can just sort of push it back and forth all the time, which is lovely. But, you know, with the rest of the painting, will be kind of more selective areas of glazing. And that's actually a process that's really hard to describe. And, you know, we could talk 5 hours about glazing. I'm sure you don't want to. But, you know, you can do so much to a painting with glazing. And it's a very magical, alchemical way of painting, because then you can paint back into the glazed layers, and you know, and that's how the painting evolves. So there's no magic kind of underpainting woo-woo stuff that's gone on. It's all actually quite direct application of paint onto a grey gesso ground. Yeah.
So you're not really using coloured pencils then, are you?
Not the white line would be a white Conte line. Yeah. But no, I think that question comes from somebody who's seen a layout drawing that looks very much like the finished work, and they've assumed that that's under the painted layer. It's not at all. You could do that. It would be completely nonsensical to do that, because you'd lose the drawing in the process. You know, you don't need that. You don't need that for the painting.
And how do you transfer your drawing onto your canvas?
So I recently discovered that lovely paper that the Americans have, they're called Surreal paper, you know, the kind of that's already chalked up, and they have it in different colors. Is it called Surreal, something like that? And the Americans have amazing art materials. Right. It comes in rolls, and it's basically tracing paper for artists. And that's quite nice. But before I discovered that, I used to buy sheets of carbon paper that you used to use in the old-fashioned typewriters. And I've often used that to trace, because it's very thin. It gives a very dense line, or too dense. Sometimes you have to kind of get rid of the excess of black line that it leaves on the panel. I mean, you can literally chalk up your own piece of paper, or just cover a piece of paper with graphite. So it's normally a process of direct tracing through from a drawing onto the panel with some kind of.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, with some kind of tracing paper, you know. And as I've just tried to describe, there are many different kind of versions of that you can make your own, or you buy the fancy stuff or whatever.
And how do you get the white line then? Do you go over it again with the white line?
Well, no. So the Surreal comes in white.
Yeah, right.
And it's actually, I have to say, Surreal paper, and I'm probably pronouncing this completely wrong. You'll be inundated with offended kind of American artists. But anyway, whatever it's called, that amazing, yes, that amazing tracing paper that they use. It's great. It's great because it's kind of, it's off the roll, and I think it comes in 4 different colors. It comes in black, white, red, and blue. So, what more could you want? It probably comes in more colors, but it leaves quite a fat, ploddy line. I have to say, it's not the actual carbon typewriter paper. You can get a much more subtle line. But yeah, lately I've been using that. But if I correct any aspect of the drawing, whether I've traced it through in black or white or blue or red, when I correct any aspect of that drawing, I'll always use a white Conte pencil, just because I just like it. And also I'm then aware of what's the correction of what and what's the initial drawing. So again, it's leaving a trace of the kind of thought process, and it's almost like note to self, like, oh yeah, I thought the edge of that chair was there, but no, now I'm deciding it's sort of here, or now I want it to be here, or whatever it might be, So it's nice to have all of that kind of DNA footprints left, in the drawing.
Yeah. Okay. Robert Lynch on Instagram says, she's so fire. I don't know what that means. I think it's a good thing. Can you ask if she does color studies and if she has or will do any online courses? She's so far.
Color studies. What does he mean by color studies?
The little small kind of poster things working out the color.
Oh, yes. No. Yeah, I've seen, I wish I did those. I see so much stuff on Instagram. I think, God, I wish I did that, No, they look great. I would love to do those, kind of almost like little tiny oil sketches where you kind of break it down to its essential. No, I don't, is the honest truth. I've never felt the need to do those, but I think they're beautiful things in their own right, I have to say. When they work, they really work. So, I think for me, there's so many things I'd love to explore, but for me, I always feel like I just don't have enough time. And I think the older you get, the more that sense of not having enough time becomes really quite frantic. So and I always feel behind with my own projects, which is always a horrible feeling. So I'm always coming into the studio thinking a slight sense of suffocation, because I feel that I should be, 2 months ahead of where I am or whatever. So yeah, it'd be lovely to put a week aside to do those, but no, I don't do them. Online courses, I have done a bit of teaching, physical teaching, and I love teaching. I have to say, it surprised me how much I enjoyed it, but I found it absolutely shattering. I mean, I would come home from a day's teaching and I would need to be in a flotation tank for a day just to kind of recharge my batteries. So, and it's made me slightly wary of kind of going back into it, but I know I will one day, because I know I have a lot to teach, and I did really enjoy it, and my students loved it. And always got very good feedback from teaching. So yeah, watch this space. I think something will happen. I think I'm more drawn to the idea of doing one-off workshops, maybe, than doing online courses. Although I realize online is a very good tool for people to access,
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned panels. Why do you only like panels? What's your reasoning behind that?
I like the rigidity of the surface. So I like to work on a really rigid surface. I did paint on canvases when I first started oil painting, as everybody does, because you think that's what you do when you paint with oils. And great, canvas is great, but there's always that slight, however much you've stretched and tensed the canvas, there's always that slight kind of bounce and tension that you get off it. And that limits what you can do with the surface of it. And also because I like to prepare my panels with several layers of gesso. And I did that with my canvases as well. So then my canvases were linen canvases, and I would stretch and then I would apply several layers of gesso. But then I like to sand in between. And on a canvas, on a stretched canvas, that's quite a hard thing to do, because there's always that slight, you're always crushing into the stretches a little bit. And also because panels, think panels are beautiful anyway, but also if you're sending work to exhibition, if it feels slightly safer, a panel is less likely to get damaged than a canvas will. So that feels a little bit more secure to me, that the painting will survive on its journey to wherever it's going, you know.
Yeah. And always wooden panels, or do you use the aluminium?
No, so far I've only used wooden panels. I'm intrigued by the aluminium panels. I've heard a lot about them. I'm sure they're perfectly fine. I do sort of wonder what the longevity, you know, applying gesso onto an aluminium panel. I think, oh, really? Will that start to peel off after 10 years? Or it's quite a new thing, isn't it, the aluminium panel? Although, of course, artists painted on copper sheets historically, and they've survived fine. So I like what I've seen is drawings. So drawings on paper that are on aluminium panels for rigidity, and they look very beautiful. I think Paula Rego did a few. Her larger works were like that, and that looks like a beautiful surface. It looks like a beautiful thing in its own right before you've even done anything to it. So far for me, it's been wooden panels, but they're the proper the panels with the stretches with the, you know, whatever they're called, you know, the thick panels, not a sheet of wood, but with the proper kind of skeleton on the back, as it were.
Yeah, like a tray.
Exactly. Yeah.
Vicky Sullivan on Patreon, thanks for the tea, Vicky, says, "Hi Miriam, your work is lovely. I'd love to know what colours are on your palette, and what did you mix for that gorgeous neutral green behind the lady with the teacups?" She's talking to Angel, with Angel at my table. Also, how do you go about deciding on a background colour?
Well, thank you. What colours do I have on my palette? I don't follow this kind of rigid palettes that people love. And I've never really learnt them. I have found the palette that works for me very organically, just through process of trial and error. I paint predominantly with Mussini Schminke oil paints. It's a German make, very, very good quality oil paints. But they make they make a lot of transparent and semi-transparent pigments. Interestingly, I've noticed a lot of other oil paint makers now have started to bring out a lot more kind of transparent pigments, because I think that people have kind of tuned into glazing a little bit now and sort of trying to. But, you know, when I started oil painting, all the oil paintings you could buy were kind of completely opaque, like polyfiller, most of them, you know, and that's not what I wanted to do. So I found kind of these German paint. In fact, it was my father who had been using them, who said to me, in fact, he handed me a whole range of oil colors that he'd been using. And interestingly, I still have tubes of oil paint that my father gave me whenever this was 30 years ago now, that are still as fresh as they were mixed yesterday. So they're very, very, very lovely oil paints. And I use a bit of Old Holland, and I've got a couple of Michael Harding paints in there. And, you know, so there's a bit of a hybrid, but it's predominantly kind of Mussini colors. And on my palette, I will always have, what will I always have? Okay, so when it comes to flesh tones, because obviously it really depends on what you're painting. When it comes to flesh tones, I will always have burnt sienna, King's blue, yellow ochre, titanium white, zinc white. I've recently started using lead white, which is a little bit iffy in the UK because you're not supposed to, but it's an amazing, it has an amazing quality. So I think my zinc white might become more and more redundant as I go forward. Ultramarine, some kind of Madder Lake, or some kind of, you know, one of those deep kind of purpley reds. And what else? I've probably left something out. Always a touch of raw umber. You always need a touch of raw umber on your palette. So it's a kind of very earth palette. I use a lot of earth colors. I tend to hardly ever touch cadmium red or cadmium yellow. or those kind of really brutally hyperpigmented, saturated, opaque oil paints, because I find that they tend to just completely take over. They're kind of the bully boys of the palette. You can't mix them with anything because they just completely, when I was teaching, I used to refer to them as cocaine. They kind of, that's the cocaine end of your palette. And if you're ever going to use it, you just want the tiniest sniff of that in your color mix, because it will just take over your painting. So yeah, I think the earth colors do an awful lot for you. They're incredibly subtle. They're very intermixable. And so I think a palette that's predominantly earth color with a few touches of non-earth colors works really well, because you just get a nice bounce between the two.
Do you
background?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go on.
And I was going to ask you about black. Do you use black or not?
I tend not to use black because I find that I don't need it. But if I ever did need to use black, I certainly wouldn't be hung up about using it. I mean, it's a color like any other color. It's not actually a very nice color to use in oil paint black, and it's and you can make much deeper blacks without using black. So one of my favorite really deep, like inky, deep color is I mix Van Dyke brown and indigo. And that gives me something that looks like black on the canvas, but it's just got this depth that you never get with black. Black is a very dead, flat color. It's like white. White is a dreadful color in painting. It's a killer, and if you mix too much white into your colors, it's a killer. So black and white are absolutely black less so. White is absolutely necessary in oil painting, because oil painting doesn't have any light unless you put the light into it, and the only way you can do that is through the whites or the light pigments. But yeah, there can be an over-reliance on whites, and there can be and black is really very seldom necessary. But I don't think any color's forbidden. I'm not a fascist when it comes to what's on my palette. I think if it works, it works. Yep. I think the quality of the paint matters more to me than, whatever family of colors it comes from. Yeah.
So you were going to say about backgrounds?
So that was the second part of the question, wasn't it? How do
you decide on background colors?
Well, so the default perfect background for a portrait would always be a kind of darkish tone of gray, because it just works so well against skin tone. So if you look at most historical portraits, there'll be one version of that or another. And mixing a good gray is an interesting thing. You always need, you always arrive at a better gray if you mix kind of two complementary colors together, because there's a live cellular structure to that color, rather than kind of, mixing a black and a white and then just adding, taking it from there, as it were. But actually what I do is that I build up my backgrounds with a lot of glazing. So that's how I make them much, much more subtle. And you get that sense of space, because obviously when you're glazing, you're basically adding one transparent layer of color over another transparent layer of color. And in that process, you can adjust, especially the shadows. I mean, the shadows were just born to be glazed, So you can do wonders in the shadows, but you can also do amazing things with the lights. But the payoff of all of that is that you're actually, when you're looking at the painting, your eyes it doesn't realize it's doing it, but your eyes traveling through all those layers of paint. So it's kind of traveling through space. It's reading all that information through space. And so you optically get a sense of space in the painting in the way that you don't when you just use a kind of alla prima approach. You can get an impression of space that can be very, very effective, but it's a different optical thing. And that kind of really fascinates me, what glazing can do with a sense of space. It can be very, very subtle and very kind of seductive. And then, of course, it can make the lights really kind of play off that and bounce off that,
Yeah. Um, do you have a particular medium that you like to use a lot of?
Yeah. Yeah. Medium is what medium you use, I think, is really probably the most important decision. The thing that will affect your painting the most. And again, it depends on how you, if you want to paint with a palette knife, you don't particularly need a medium. And if you want to paint in a very kind of thick impasto or kind of alla prima way, you don't particularly need a medium. But if you want to paint in layers, or if you want it, definitely, if you can't glaze without a medium. So if you're glazing, you absolutely by default need a medium. And I make my own medium. And it's the same recipe that will have been used for hundreds of years, you know, tweaked one way or another. And it's a mixture of cold pressed linseed oil, rectified spirit of turpentine. So that's the proper stuff, the smelly turp stuff, which I love. And some Damar varnish as a cicative in the medium. And that gives an incredibly fluid medium for me. And it kind of, the Damar varnish, as well as being a cicative, keeps some aspect of the glossiness of the paint. So you don't get that kind of terrible sinking that you get, especially when you paint in layers. It can become a real problem. And then I use a different version of that for the incredibly fine detail, where instead of the cold pressed linseed oil, I'll use walnut oil. But walnut oil is not very strong structurally, so you don't want to be evolving your whole painting with a medium made with walnut oil, because it will be quite a weak polymer. But you can use it definitely for the kind of final touches, or the very kind of really fine layers of glaze at the end stage of a painting. But yeah, I mean, I believe that's the kind of medium that, I don't know, Van Eyck would have used. I mean, these ingredients, they are the old school kind of painting ingredients that have been used since the invention of oil painting. So, yeah.
And
I tend not to be a fan of... Go on.
No, go ahead. You tend not to be a fan
of
what?
I tend not to be a fan of kind of modern substitutes. And I mean, I realize some people, for health reasons or whatever, need to avoid certain. But again, through teaching, I got quite familiar with some of these modern kind of low odor solvents and kind of oil paints that are not really oil paints, but they're called oil paints, but they're sort of, you can dilute them with water and that kind of stuff, because students would bring them in all excitedly and show me this stuff. And I would try it out, and it just was like, it was just nothing like oil paint should be or can be, or, you know, they're very kind of poor substitutes. So I've never found anything as good as the medium that I use. I've found mediums that you can buy that are using exactly the same ingredients. But you know, as I've been mixing my own medium for years, I'll just carry on doing that.
And the fumes don't bother you, no?
No, I love them. No, I love the smell of turps. No, I mean, I sound like a junkie. No, I love the smell of turps. It's a beautiful, beautiful. And I'm not a kind of, I'm not a very sensitive person. I mean, I don't have an allergy to it. And actually, the thing is, if you have good studio hygiene, you know, if you don't have some massive jam jar full of white spirits swirling around all day long, that's just evaporating, and, you know, if you're kind of quite neat and tidy in your studio, it shouldn't really be a problem. It's just that, again, I don't know what it is. I mean, some people, I think that it's almost as if they think that part of being an oil painter means that you have to be sloppy and kind of, you know, have paint splodged all over your easel. And it's kind of, you don't have to paint that way. You know, you can be, so I keep my medium in a dropper bottle. I mean, primarily because I like to control the amount of medium that I'm adding to my paint. That's the main reason. I don't want to be flooding the paint mix on my palette with medium. But the fact that it's kept in a dropper bottle means it's not evaporating into the studio. And equally, I have a very tiny, tiny kind of little jam jar thing where I keep the turps that I wash my brushes out in. But, you know, there's a lid on that all the time. So that's not evaporating to the studio. I found, again, when I was teaching at art school, that people would come in with these low odor solvents, and because they couldn't smell them, they would literally have half a gallon of the stuff swishing around, and they'd be happily, and this stuff would just be coming into the ether all the time, you're still inhaling it. It's still doing you just as much harm. You just can't smell it. It's actually more dangerous, I think, to not smell, you know, the solvents.
It just occurred to me, the smell of turpentine probably is a lovely reminder of your childhood, though, for you, is it?
Definitely, yeah. I remember. And it's very interesting because turpentine you buy in different countries has different smell. And of course, now we all are turpentine, God knows where the terps comes from that we buy here. And, you know, because it's all distilled pine resin. But I remember the Spanish turpentine the Spanish turpentine of my childhood had a very particular smell that's very different to the turpentine that I buy here. And if I buy turpentine from Roberson, it has a very particular different smell to the turpentine that I buy from Jackson's. And I'm sure that if I went to a studio, a sort of American artist studio, their terps would smell completely different. And in Italy, it would smell so, which I find really fascinating. It's like when you buy earth pigments, you know, if you buy a yellow ochre from one particular place, it'll be completely different to a yellow ochre from a different, you know, so everything, it's a reminder of how organic the nature of paint is, you know.
Yeah.
Of course, it's something we've completely lost sight of in our modern life because we walk into art shops and buy everything already mixed for us in tubes. And so there's actually, it's very easy to have very little understanding of the materials you're using because you don't have to. You just read the instructions on the back of the tube. And we're also impatient to get creative and to get mark making and to get drawing and to get painting, that often all of that kind of understanding of the material and the mixing and the making is kind of edited out of the artistic process, which is a real shame because actually, again, there's an opportunity to tweak all of that to make it more your own. So if you mix your own medium, you can actually perfect a medium that's just right for your speed of painting and what you want, how quickly you want the medium to dry, how flowy you want it to be, how viscous you want it to be. You can be in control of all of that.
Yeah.
But you never will be if all you ever do is buy a shop bought medium because you won't really know what you're using. You know, But anyway, that's modern world for you. That can be applied to every aspect of our lives.
And what about brushes? Do you have a favorite kind of type of brush or make of brush?
No, I mean, every time I walk into an art shop, I will be buying a different type of brush because I just get curious and I see them and I think, oh, that looks good, you know. So predominantly, I've got every brush make under the sun, and a lot of them just gathering dust, not being used at all. So I will use hog hair brushes for the kind of bigger passages of paint, the backgrounds, the initial stages of paint where I'm really working in quite big sort of areas. I get on very, very well with synthetic brushes. So I use a lot of synthetic brushes when I'm sort of scaling down the mark making a little bit. And again, because I don't want the brush mark to be part of my work. So with hog hair brushes, you will always leave a footprint on the panel. Yeah. So at some point I've got to leave those. They've done their work. And I move on to kind of synthetic brushes. Or semi-synthetic brushes, and I'll have a ton of those, a whole range of them, different shapes, and then of course I have probably the smallest brushes you can buy, which are the 4-0 ones, with which I do all the kind of, you know, microscopic detail that I really get into at the kind of last stages of the painting. So yeah, every make of brush, every size of brush, every shape of brush. But amongst all of that, there'll be some that I will be predominantly using all the time. And it won't be the better brushes. Sometimes it's the really crappy, cheapy ones that I've bought that just somehow, they just do what I need them to do. And they stand up well to, you know, being cleaned and washed every night and they're kind of back on the easel the next day. And, you know, so yeah, that's my answer to that one, really. A confused hodgepodge.
How do you check yourself as you're working? You know, like some artists turn the canvas upside down, or they'll be taking
Oh,
photos on their
yes.
phone, or they'll be using mirrors a lot, or they'll be getting their friends in, or, you know, what kind of
Yeah,
things do you do?
I step back a bit and I turn my head to the side. I stick my head upside down. I sometimes squint, but I do have a mirror that I look at the paint. You know, when I want a sharp look at the painting, yeah, I'll use the mirror because it just does that fresh take, doesn't it, for you? I very, very seldom, in fact, never really take a photo on my iPhone. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm in love with my iPhone and I take a zillion photos like we all do. But iPhone photos are dreadful because they completely make your painting oversaturated, overcontrasted, and it's not a true representation of the painting. They kind of, iPhone photos are designed to make photos look sexy. They're not actually designed to be absolutely accurate to what they're photographing. So I find that they can be deceptive that way. So I don't rely on that. Unless I'm taking a photo because I'm seeing someone 2 hours later and I want to say, oh, look, and this is what I'm working on. But, you know, that seldom happens either. But no, it's basically a mirror or sticking my head upside down and looking at the work that way. Yeah.
Okay. What kind of lighting setup do you have in your studio?
I've got 2 very big windows in my studio, so I get a lot of good daylight. But as we know, the light in the UK changes every minute. So I also have overheads, I think they're halogen lights, but they're kind of daylight halogen lights. But what I have that gets me through is I have a big a professional picture restorer's light that I've had again for about 30 years. And again, it was a hand-me-down from my father. They're very expensive. It's a gruesome looking thing. It's not aesthetic at all. It's ugly, ugly, ugly. They're hugely expensive. I'm not sure if they're even making them anymore. But it has a kind of fluorescent light system, but they're the closest to daylight fluorescent lights. And they're the lights that they use for picture restoration in the National Gallery and museums. They're made for museums, basically. So that's fantastic because I'm a very nocturnal worker. So I'm often working in the evenings and when there's literally no daylight left, and that will be on all the time, just providing constant light.
Yeah, right.
And even sometimes during the day, if the light is very off or grey, I will have that on as a kind of constant source of light, but away from the painting. You know, not burning a hole into away from the painting. So it's just creating a sort of ambient sense of light on the. I mean, lighting is it's a really tricky thing, and it will drive you nuts. And it does drive me nuts because it affects everything. It affects the painting process. It affects the way you see the painting. It affects the way you photograph the painting. It's a constant bane of the artist's life. It's really, you know, the color temperature of the light, the source of light. So I actually think, in a sense, having an artificial light that you work with all the time is probably sometimes the best scenario because at least it's a consistent light that you have.
Yeah.
You know, all the time.
Yeah. Do you listen to anything as you paint?
Yes, I mean at the moment I listen to a lot of Radio 4. It kind of tends to be on all day long because it kind of marks my day for me. And I'm a bit of a news junkie, and Radio 4 News is very good. And there's a lot of news to keep up with in the world at the moment. It's a very interesting kind of end of epoch times that we're going through, or it feels like it. I mean, I used to listen to a lot of music. I don't anymore for some reason. I can't explain why that is. I used to listen to a lot of classical music, and I used to listen to a lot of Radio 3. But yeah, it's predominantly Radio 4. I occasionally listen to podcasts, occasionally listen to audiobooks. It depends what stage of the painting process I'm on. If I'm at the kind of ploddy, blocking in kind of painting, then I can be orally distracted like that. It doesn't matter. But if I'm at a really intense working things out stage of the painting, I almost have to just have silence really,
Right.
in order to let my brain occupy all of that space. Yeah.
Yeah. What's on Radio 4? I don't know the different radio channels. Is it mostly talking or is it music?
Yeah, Radio 4 is Radio 4 is the kind of highbrow BBC kind of news, current. I don't know how they call themselves. It's predominantly news. It's got annoying things like The Archers. Again, sorry, anyone who's a huge fan, but it's got stuff that I don't like to listen to. But yeah, it's predominant. They have this amazing the Today program in the morning that lasts 3 hours, where it's just news, and interviews, and then the 1 o'clock news, and then the 5 p.m. news, and and interspersed amongst all that, quite interesting programs actually. It's very good. Radio 4 is very good. I recommend.
Okay.
What do you have in Ireland? What do you listen to?
I don't really listen to the radio.
No.
I'm sure there's a. Yeah, I'm sure there's a. No, there wouldn't be a.
Is there a main?
Yeah, well, there's RTE. So I think there's Radio 1 and Radio 2, and Radio 2 I think is pop mostly, and then Radio 1 is more talk. And then there's another station which is Lyric FM, which is classical pretty much. And then there's lots of other pop kind of, radio stations. But yeah, I don't listen to the radio much, so I don't know exactly. So I'm looking at your studio behind there. You've got a lot of things, on the wall. Do you have any quirky, unusual object that you use that you've come up with yourself that you haven't heard of any other painters using that people might be interested to hear about?
Ooh, I'm sure I do. And would I want to tell anyone if I could remember? I'm trying to think. God, what do I use? What have I come up with? Well, yeah. I mean, it's probably not the best answer. It's the only thing I can think of at the moment. I do construct props for my paintings. I know that's not quite the essence of your question, but so yeah, there's a lot of kind of little maquettes and little constructed objects that find their way into my work. Yeah, gosh, I've slightly gone blank on that one, John. Sorry. If I think of anything groundbreaking, I'll interject.
For the very fine detail, do you use magnification at all?
No. I use reading glasses, which annoys the hell out of me because I've always had perfect vision. And this is a kind of recent thing in my life. And I'm still getting used to, having to use those when I paint. But no, I've never used any kind of magnification for painting.
All right. Amy Floyd in Arizona says, "Hi from Arizona. My question is, your paintings are so detailed, absolutely amazing, in brackets. How do you know when it's finished? It seems like at any point you could be done and it would look amazing, but you keep going until it is photorealistic. Do you get to a stopping point or do you feel you could always keep going? Hope this makes sense. Love your work."
Thank you. Yeah, it makes total sense. Yeah, it's a very good question. I think the honest answer to that is that I carry on a piece until I can't take it any further.
Okay.
Seriously. No, that's the honest. And I realize there's something a bit compulsive about that. And I wonder if it's a good thing or a bad thing. And I do think that maybe I need to rein that in a little bit. And maybe I need to stop before I've kind of dotted every I and crossed every T in a painting. And I've often thought that, and I kind of can't quite help myself. I always have to take it to that nth degree. So it's a very prescient question, actually, because it's a conversation that I have with myself a lot about my work. And I think going back to the drawing, part of why I love drawing as much, I love drawing. Drawing's a beautiful thing. Who doesn't love drawing? part of why I want to engage with drawing more is because there's a limit to how far I can take a drawing. The thing about oil paint, you see, is that I think it's a magical medium for me. And I think you can take oil paint to the nth degree, to the power of 9. You know, to me, it feels like such a limitless medium that if I see there's a possibility for taking it further, I just have to go there. And I can't edit myself. I can't say, no, we'll just leave that to the imagination, leave that to the viewer, leave that, you know, I have to. Whereas with drawing or other mediums, another medium that I love is pastel. There's a limit to how far you can take it. At least there's a limit to how far I can take it. And that allows for an element of, I mean, abstraction would be a ridiculous word, but you know what I mean? That allows for an element of incompletion in the work, which is a very beautiful thing. And I love that in other people's work. And I realize that I don't really leave that in my oil paintings. And I'm not going to be really harsh on myself about that, because it's just how I work and it's just what I do. But yeah, that it's a very alive question for me at the moment, this sense of when is a painting finished? So yes, the honest answer to that is a painting's finished when I know that I can't add anything more to it that will take it somewhere else. I can't add anything more.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also when I've sort of achieved what I set out to achieve. So that's the first step to that answer. There's several, you know, so there's a sense of an idea that you want to achieve in a painting. So when you've achieved that, you know, you've achieved a certain stage of completion, but then you can take that further. Yeah.
Yeah. Kathleen Stewart on Patreon. Thanks for the tea, Kathleen. Says, Miriam, your figures are rendered in such a classical style. In contrast, your landscapes, when included in a painting, are quite whimsically rendered and a bit otherworldly. Is it your intention to create this dichotomy of space? And if so, is it a fanciful world imagined by the figure in the painting?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, oh gosh, is it intentional? Is it not intentional? I always want to have elements in my painting that. So I know my paintings are very, very realistic. I know that they're often described as hyper-realistic. That's fine. They're often described as photorealistic, which I don't like that description so much, because I don't feel that's what I'm trying to do, and it's not something that I'm. But within all of that realism, I always try to have an element of, well, what we were saying earlier, magical realism or kind of faux realism, if you like, false realism, in the sense that you're using the language of realism to describe something that doesn't really exist, or to describe something that is fanciful or whimsical or allegorical, or and I think I always try to have an element of that in my work somewhere. Sometimes it's a very tiny element and it's very subtle. In other works, it can be more obvious. So in the works where there is a bit of a landscape in the painting or as part of the composition, then I guess that becomes more obvious, that shift between the representational world and the imagined world. So it's kind of, I'm trying to create a link between the two. So it's the world that we see, but it's the world that we imagine and the world that we feel, which is so much part of what we carry around inside of us all of the time. And it's what we project onto the world that we see. So it's kind of, it's trying to sort of fuse those two elements together. And I use realism as a sort of, as a doorway into that. I mean, I use realism obviously because I like it, and I'm very captivated by realistic paintings myself. It's a language that I respond to in painting. But I try to do something else with it. It's not just about, oh, you know, look at that teacup and the little glare on the. And I think I'm doing it more consciously now than I did when I started painting. When I started painting, it was very much about, oh, aren't I clever? Yeah, I managed to paint that teacup. It looks fantastic and it looks very realistic. And I was very pleased with that at the very early stages. but now I'm much more consciously realizing that it's a powerful skill to have with which you can do something else. You can kind of open a door into a different sense of perception in the painting. So that's really what I'm trying to do without being too obvious about it, or too preachy about it, as it were.
And you've talked about it in terms of, from your perspective, is there any element of what they were asking about, that it's the figure's way of seeing the world?
Sorry, ask that again, John. I slightly got lost in that.
So Kathleen was saying, is a fanciful world imagined by the figure in the painting? You know, is it the figure's way of seeing the world?
Yes, it's actually my fanciful world that I'm projecting onto the painting, because of course I'm the megalomaniac that's creating the work, right? Artists, no, you know what I'm saying? I say sort of, but it's true. Artists project all of their stuff onto. But yes, no, the idea is that I'm sort of trying to. I think she's probably thinking about the painting of the portrait of my father, I suspect. So in that portrait of my father, there's a little window. It's a very kind of Flemish style. There's a little window to the right of him that's got this very kind of magical, whimsical little landscape behind it. And that was very much intended to be an aspect of my father's personality.
Yeah.
So, you know, my father is a painter, and he spent many years painting kind of floral themed paintings. And my father is like a sort of St. Francis of Assisi kind of character. He's really like a monk, and he could happily just be sitting there amongst the daisies and the butterflies and not needing to interact. You know, there's very much that side of, and that's something that he very much tried to express through his work. So I thought that would be a very nice compositional touch, but also a touch that describes something about his character and his personality. So that's a very literal example of that. But in other paintings, it can happen in much more subtle ways. So, for example, in the portrait of my mother, all those kind of elements on the table, the teapot and the teacups, and they were there because this was my mother's environment. I mean, she loved sitting at the kitchen table, having a cup of tea and chatting till the cows came home. But also those objects provided a device to describe something about time, and because there's a slight sense of movement in some of the objects. Again, that was to allow a slightly mystical element into what at a first glance appears to be a very kind of classical portrait. So that was very intentional, and that was really to describe in a poetic way, really, my relationship with my mother. So it wasn't so much about her; it was actually about how I see her, the kind of emotional world that you share. You know,
it's all about you, Miriam.
It's all about me.
Now, if you're thinking to yourself, God, I'm really enjoying this podcast. I've listened to a few now and they're brilliant. And there's so many of them. And I've learned so much from listening to them. And you know what? If I met that John Dalton fella in real life, I'd love to buy him a cup of tea and have a chat with him. I'd love to do that every month if I could. Well, now you can. The tea part at least, because this podcast runs on cups of tea bought for me by people like you who listen to the podcast and send me the price of a cup of tea once a month through the Patreon account. That's patreon.com/John Dalton Gently Does It, all one word. And if you're one of those people who already send me cups of tea through Patreon, thanks a million. The tea is lovely and I really appreciate it. Now, the great thing is that if you can't afford to send me the price of a cup of tea, or you don't want to, that's fine. You still get exactly the same podcast for free. It's sort of an honor system where the people who can afford it and want to pay for the people who can't or don't want to. So it's all lovely. So if you'd like to send me a cup of tea once a month, you can do that through Patreon. I'd really appreciate it. It makes a huge difference to me. If you're listening and you're wondering who Miriam's dad is, it's Jose Escofet, and you can find him online. I'll put a link in the show notes to him, but his work is brilliant as well. Nikita Shah in India says, why is hyperrealism so important? And then they also say, what is artistic about copying what we see? And then Sheila Walsh here in Ireland, and on Patreon, thanks for the tea, Sheila, says, your talent and work are on another level. Incredible. The detail is so intricately correct and realistic, yet I wouldn't class your paintings as realism. I think they very much have your hand and an ethereal quality. Is realism what you're striving for, or your own interpretation of the subject? Thanks. So, realism.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the comments, and very good questions. And I think I sort of touched upon it a little bit in the last answer, so going back to the first question, what's the point of painting something as you see it, which I think was basically the nuts and bolts of that question. And it's a perfectly valid question. There's a lot of criticism of hyper-realistic work or kind of photorealistic work. Again, I don't like my paintings described as photorealistic because I don't see them that way, but I understand that some people do see them that way. I think the style in which you paint is irrelevant. Is completely irrelevant, and it's a very personal thing to every artist. It's basically like your signature or your voice. You can be a baritone, you can be a soprano, you can be a mezzo soprano. You can't help it. It's who you are as an artist, and it's your language. Ultimately, it's all art. It can be good art or it can be bad art. That's, so I kind of don't understand why people are so obsessed with style and so critical of style. It would be like me saying, I hate all abstract painting, which is not true. I mean, abstract painting is actually not my shtick. It's not my bag. It's not the first thing I'm going to run to see when I enter a museum. But I've seen abstract paintings that are exquisitely beautiful, that I think are very good art. And I've seen some atrocious abstract paintings. So it's the same with realism and hyperrealism and photorealism and whatever kind of label you want to stick to it. It's either good or it's bad. But it's not the style that's at fault. The style is just, it might not be your predilection as a viewer, but it's no more valid or less valid than any other style. And I think even within the artistic community as well, there's a lot of sort of angst about what figurativism should be and what's valid within the figurative world and what isn't valid and what's better and what's worse. And I think they're all quite empty arguments, really. So yeah, that's all I can say about that. I think it's what you do with the tools that you're using that really matters, which kind of comes onto the second question, really, which, I think she was saying, what is your intention to be completely representational? No, my intention is not to be completely representational. I use that to do something, hopefully, that goes somewhere else in the painting. I'm not assuming that I achieve that or I don't achieve that. That's my intention. So it's never just about being able to paint a glass of water or someone's nose or eyelid perfectly well. I mean, that's kind of the tool set that you're using, and it's great that you can do that. And in fact, it's essential that you can do that in this genre of painting. But that's just a stepping stone into something else. So I basically want to create paintings that move people. I want people to be moved when they look at my work. Now, I realize probably most people won't be moved when they look at my work. But if I can move some people some of the time, then that's basically what I'm aiming to do. And I think that's what most artists aim to do. I mean, painting is a form of communication, put it in its simplest kind of terms. So, the skill of painting is just an exercise. so to be able to paint something well, bravo, well done, fantastic. But what are you going to do with that? Is what you do with it that really matters. And actually, it sounds like that's a hard thing to find out as an artist. It can take artists a lifetime to really sort of understand for themselves why they paint. I mean, why do we paint? It's not an easy question to answer. So it's a whole exploration that sort of goes, but painting has meaning. I don't know what the meaning of it is, by the way. I know that painting has meaning. And in my paintings, I'm searching for a meaning. And that's just the kind of ongoing conversation. So no, it's not, the aim is never to be, never define realism for realism's sake. I actually find that very cold and I do see paintings that I think are that, and they don't do it for me. So I would never want to be that kind of painter. Or at least I'm not seeing anything in those works that work might be trying to communicate, So, I mean, each work has to find its own audience. That's the other thing, that, we're all attuned differently. Yeah, that's probably a very rambled answer to that question. It's a very difficult question to answer, but because basically the question is saying, why do you do what you do? It's a very difficult thing to answer as an artist. It's a compulsion. I can't justify why I do what I do. There's no justification for it. There's no reason for doing it.
Very good. When you were talking there about the different types of artists and different genres, it seems to me that like what every artist has in common is they're trying to, as you say, communicate, but they're trying to communicate their inner, how it is inside them, in an external way, in the hope that it kind of resonates with somebody else's inner world. And out of that, then you get all the different, everything from abstract to performance art to, you name it. It's just different ways of doing that thing.
Yeah.
Gerald on Instagram says, what aspects of practice would you suggest to finesse and to avoid as an advice to budding artists?
What aspects of practice? Well, I would go back to what we were saying earlier about the use of photography, which is a very valid tool. I'm not poo-pooing it at all. But I think it can be quite dangerous for artists that are starting out, because there can be a complete over-reliance on photography as your only source material. And that can be problematic. So I would say, for any artist who wants to work figuratively, this is assuming you want to work, and actually, even if you don't want to work figuratively, this is like a sort of musician practicing their scales. They might go off and just create a primal scream, or they might go off and compose a symphony. But practicing the scales is the kind of, so I would say for any artist, if you can possibly take yourself off and draw from the figure from time to time, and I know that's not accessible to everybody. And actually, even for professional artists like me, it's a hard thing to find, because there aren't that many venues where you can go and do that. But if you can possibly take yourself off and draw from the figure, it's the best kind of reality check, the best kind of exercise. It's the best Zen experience you're ever going to have in your life. Because when I'm drawing from the model, I think because time is so precious, when every second counts when you're in front of the model, and the poses are never as long as you want them to be, and that in 20 minutes they're going to fidget, or they need to have a break, or so it kind of feels like sacred time to me. It's a very, very special environment. Any situation where I've been drawing from the model, and you're so lost in that precious moment of time that it becomes a kind of really Zen experience, and it's all about the purity of drawing. And it's the biggest ego crusher you're ever going to experience. And it's the biggest euphoric moment you're ever going to experience if the drawing comes right. So anyway, so if you can do that, I think it will be the best kind of learning tool as an artist that you can take into any kind of discipline of art that you want to do, whether you want to be a painter, an illustrator, a designer, whatever. The second thing I would say is inform yourself about the materials that you're using, because if you can't produce good work with bad materials. You really can't. It will be the most limiting thing that you can do to your art practice, whatever that is. So really inform yourself about your materials, and use good materials whenever you can. And I realize art materials aren't cheap some of the times. And if you can access classes or tutorials or courses or online courses, there's so much material out there. I mean, I'd say there's almost too much material out there at the moment. It's probably really confusing for somebody starting out because you have to filter through so much stuff. So I would say probably a good starting point would be just to look at artists' work that you really admire, and if they offer any kind of online tutorial or live classes that you can go to, then try and access that if you can. So yeah, inform yourself, learn as much as you can, get away from the photograph as much as you can, especially at the beginning. It's not going to help you, actually. I think you need to tap into it from a different direction. Yeah.
Very good. Gabba May in Norway says, in your opinion, how crucial is formal education for an artist? And what do you think about self-taught artists? Is it possible to be a great artist by being an avid learner? Thanks for sharing your thoughts. I'm really looking forward to listening to this podcast. I'm a great admirer of your work.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's perfectly feasible to be self-taught and to be a great artist. And it's, yeah, I don't have a black and white answer to that question. It's and I have to be slightly careful what I say because I bring my own prejudices into the answer. But so, I went to art school, as I was saying earlier, and it wasn't a perfect experience. I'm grateful for the time that I had at art school. I saw a lot of nonsense that went on in art school, masquerading as teaching. We got some very good teaching by some tutors. We got some appalling teaching. I'd call it zero teaching, or just actually very misguided kind of philosophy from other teachers that I think actually really screwed up some of the students. So sometimes that could be a negative experience. So not all formal education is good. If you can find good formal education, then fantastic. But there's a very art school is a very mixed bag. It's and you're going to be exposed to a lot of philosophies and a lot of ideas that you were maybe not expecting. My father's completely self-taught. My father, his childhood was completely marred by the Civil War in Spain. He had to leave school at 14. He came from a very humble working class background. He knew from the year dot that he wanted to be a painter, but in those times, going to art school was only for bourgeois kids, which he wasn't. So he sort of started off working as a kind of illustrator, and then worked for a publicity firm in Barcelona, worked as sort of all-around kind of graphic designer, and painted at home in his studio, and completely self-taught, but avidly self-taught. I mean, he would read every book on oil painting going, and had an amazing library of art books, and carried that absolute love and obsession for painting within him. And I've learned 90% of what I know, I've learned from my father, and I've been to art school. So that tells you, that kind of answers your question. Of course, I've learned from my father because he's my father, but actually I've learned from my father because he's an amazingly skilled painter. and he didn't go to art school. He's completely self-taught. So yeah, I mean, I think the answer is different for different people, different paths for different people. But if you're going to not have that formal education, you do need to inform yourself. You can't work in a vacuum. I don't think anyone can work in a vacuum. So, you know, if you haven't had that input from whichever direction, then find it for yourself, you know, and find as much material as you can.
Yeah.
On techniques and yeah.
Yeah. Do you think, though, for people who are self-taught, that the real gift that they have to have is a very clear eye about their own competency, about what they're actually doing, and a very clear idea of where they want to go? Yeah, because I see a lot, say on Instagram, people like throwing up paintings that they've done, and it's really obvious to me that they don't have that. That there's somewhere they just don't have. They can't see that it's not that great. They can't see that technically the drawing's off, the painting. You know, there's and it's not so much they're like going, oh, this is a painting, I know it's not great, but I'm just putting it up on Instagram. There's a sort of feeling of like, hey, look at this, it's great.
Yeah.
It's like,
oh God. No, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, you see that everywhere. I think that's a different thing, though. I think that's to do with, because you see that at art school. I mean, I saw some appalling work at art school, and I've seen some very shockingly bad work from people that have had formal art education. So having an art education is no guarantee of ability, weirdly. You know, it just kind of arms you with it arms you with a sort of hinterland of ideas and sort of, you know, kind of knowledge and confidence, I guess, for some people that they have had that formal art education, so therefore they are artists. You don't need a certificate to be an artist. You need, I mean, talent. What is, define the word talent? But, you know, you need, I mean, ability can be honed, but I think we're all born with different skills, you know. I think this idea that we can all be Picasso, that we can all be Leonardo da Vinci, is a very kind of modern X-Factor-ish idea that we can all be what we want to be. And I think that kind of describes what you were just saying that you see on Instagram. These are people that decide that they want to be an artist. And it would be like me thinking, oh, I just want to be a ballerina. Well, I'm never going to be a ballerina. I'm not, you know, or I want to run I want to win a gold medal at the Olympics. It's never going to happen. I don't have that kind of body, and I don't. So I think it's. I think we live in an age where we're kind of very detached from reality in many ways, and that can be a positive, empowering things in the sense that you're not defined by your everyday reality. So there's a scope of kind of moving beyond that. But I think for some people it goes to a different level of losing any kind of discernment, which is worrying. And you see it a lot. It's a very common thing. I agree with you.
Delusions of competency.
Delusions, yeah. Every right, left, and centre, and no. I think actually, what in my experience, most people that are self-taught are actually very hypercritical of their own work, which is good because that keeps them on their toes. So they're always thinking that they can improve, because there's always that sense of, and I you know, speaking about my father, there's always that sense of that. Oh, you know, they never had the opportunity to go to art school, so therefore they must be not quite as good, or they must be, and they overcompensate for that all of the time, which actually ends up meaning that they do so much better because they don't have that sense of complacency of people that sometimes just swan out of art school thinking they're the bee's knees because, you know, they've happened to be somewhere for 3 years. That doesn't guarantee that you're going to be a good artist either. It can open doors for you depending which art school you've gone to, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
I would say, yeah.
I think like when we talk about being self-taught, it's like it's a blanket kind of thing. But I'm starting to see that there is a big difference, and maybe for the sort of people who don't have that discernment about their own work, then going to some sort of atelier is probably a great thing, because somebody else will say to you, no, that's not that great actually, and here's why, and then you're like, oh yeah, I hadn't seen that before. But it seems like as you say, like it seems to be two things necessary to be good, like a good self-taught artist: to have a really clear idea of what you want it to look like crystal clear, and then have the eye to be able to know that it's there or it's not, and if it's not there, to not kind of kid yourself about it. Because without those, you do get into the delusions of competency.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that is a sort of tangential thing to this discussion is that I often find that some of the most interesting artists I see have come to art, and by art I mean fine art, obviously painting, drawing, whatever, from a different art practice. So, you know, they might have been illustrators, or they might have been working for the film industry as kind of whatever they're, you know, those kind of composite, what they called matte paintings or whatever they do for, you know, envisioning scenes and sets. And so I think that can work really well, because they bring a whole bag of skills that they've developed in a slightly different practice. So they have a critical eye already, you know, and they've been working in an arena where it either works or it doesn't work. You know, your client or your boss is not going to be tolerant of your delusions as an illustrator. You know, your illustration's either going to be good or it's not going to be good. You know, so there's a kind of degree of discernment, realism, and skill set that they bring into the painting, and often I think they produce really good work. You know, so sometimes it can be a little bit slick because they've come from that world of slightly slick kind of presentation. But again, that goes back to style. I don't mind that. What I see is the kind of, you know, and I think sometimes maybe there's a struggle with finding an idea or what it is that they want to do with those, you know, they know they want to do painting, but they don't quite know what they want to do with it, you know, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think for most artists, I think the most important tools that you're going to have come from your own inner resources, ultimately. So that will be either your ability to have a really strong vision of what kind of artist you want to be, or what kind of work you want. It's not what kind of artist you want to be. That's the wrong way. What kind of work you want to make. It will either be because you just have a certain set of skills, or you just have a talent. For some people just can naturally draw. They just have a natural eye for tone, for color. You know, some people, it just comes naturally to them. And if they develop that, they can produce amazing work. But there's so many, I think there's so many, there's like magical parts of the equation that you need to be a good artist. So you can be incredibly skilled. And by the way, I personally think you can't be a good artist without having the skills. So I'm a real kind of traditionalist in that way. I think you need your tools, and then you can go off and, you know, run the marathon or whatever. But you can be incredibly skilled. That's not necessarily going to make you a good artist, sadly, because you need to bring something to that. And that's the difficult bit, and that's the scary bit, because you need to bring your own inner world into the work that you're doing. And I think not everybody, well, actually, I think that's a rare thing for people to do. I think it's not something that people feel comfortable with a lot of the time. You know, it feels very exposing. It feels very, but also it's something that most people wouldn't even begin to know how to do that, because it's not a language that we're taught. You know, it's not, when we go to school, we're not taught to express ourselves in that way, or, you know, it's unfamiliar territory, and it's often when you and it's a brave thing to do. And I think most people choose safety in life quite rationally. I mean, it's a mad thing to do, to be an artist. It's a slightly mad thing to do. You're not quite normal if you want to be an artist. You're already slightly on the edges. Most people seek security in life, which is a completely normal survival instinct. You know, most people need to know that they have security and comfort. You know, you risk all of that by being a full-time artist. You know, you just, there's no guarantee of any of that, however great an artist you may or may not be. So there's many factors working against you before you even get off, you know, the starting block, really. You know, there's many...
a lot of athletic analogies going on there.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, this is a unintentional segue, but Adrian in London asks, what impact did winning the BP Portrait Award in 2018 have on you, A, personally, and B, professionally?
So thank you, Adrian. Hi, Adrian. I know Adrian. He's a great life model, by the way. Well, it had a huge effect, undoubtedly. It was... yeah, I mean, it had a huge effect. Professionally, it brought an awful lot of attention my way. The world looks at you differently if you've won an award. I'm still the same person that I was before I won that award, and I'm still the same artist that I was before I won that award. But the world looks at me differently after winning that award, and that's just the way art world operates. So, you know, it matters. And I'm very grateful for that. And yeah, I mean, I had, you know, many interviews and articles, and also as a consequence of winning the BP Portrait Award, I was commissioned to paint the portrait of the Queen. That happened, you know, the following year. So that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't won, because that was the kind of validation that was needed for me to get that commission to paint the portrait of the Queen. But also on a personal level. So personally, as an artist, what was really interesting about winning the BP Portrait Award is that portrait of my mother was probably the most personal painting I painted to date. And it had... I think it's the painting where I've risked the most. It's a very, I've risked the most because I've expressed something in that painting that's very much to do with me rather than to do with my ideas about the world and kind of, you know, aspects of it and kind of that. And I tried something very new in that painting, which I hadn't tried before. And I had no idea whether any of that would work, whether people would respond to that at all. And lo and behold, it all worked. People responded to it phenomenally. And it won me the first prize, precisely because of those things that I had tried to put into the painting. So that was a huge... I got so many messages from the public, generally, you know, people that I've never met and I'll never meet, you know, who responded very, very strongly to the painting. And yeah, they said that when they looked at the painting, they saw their own mother, or it reminded them of their mother that had passed away the previous year. Or, I got, I mean, literally hundreds of messages like that from the public, which were very, very touching and very moving. Particularly because the idea of mortality, not in a morbid way, but the idea of the finiteness of time spent with somebody, was very much in that portrait, because when I painted that portrait, my mother would have been 84, I think, around about that age. And, you know, she was starting to get a few health problems, and I was very, as you are when your parents get to that age, you're very aware that you're not going to have them around forever. And that was very much the idea behind the painting. So the fact that people saw that very strongly in the work, was just really rewarding for me as an artist, and actually has made me braver, I think, because it kind of makes me realize, and actually it's not the first time it's happened. I've experienced this before, that it's often the works where you think, oh God, no one's really going to get this, or no one's really going to understand it. It's a bit crazy. I'm going to spend a year painting this and no one's going to buy it because it's going to work out so expensive. But I'm going to do it anyway because I've got to do it. And it's often the works where you risk the most that people really respond to the work. And that's really interesting as an artist, because that's kind of what it's all about, because you're actually showing them something very unique. And people that are open to that and that can see it respond to it. Yeah. So it's a good note to self. That. Winning the award was like the biggest tick I could have had in response to that. Yes, this is what you need to do, Miriam, going forward. Don't hold back. Yeah, which is really kind of that's a great message to get as an artist. Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah, I love trotting out the Hemingway quote, about there's nothing, his quote is, there's nothing to writing, you just sit down at the typewriter and bleed. And it's like, I think that applies across, I know with writing, it's like the writing that you feel the most cringy about, or the painting that you feel is revealing too much.
Yes.
Is the one that hits the mark with people. Yeah.
Always. Yeah. Yeah.
So speaking of the portrait of Queen Elizabeth, Debbie Nijbor on Facebook says, I'd like to know how the request for making a painting of the Queen was done, and how you came to this impression. Did you meet her, make pictures of her? How was that procedure?
Yeah. So that's So a year after winning the BP Portrait Award, which was in 2018, in fact, less than a year afterwards, I think it was in March of the following year, the permanent Undersecretary of State to the Foreign Office at the time, Sir Simon MacDonald, who was coming to the end of his term as the permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign Office, wanted to commission a portrait of the Queen for a new reception room at the Foreign Office. And so he went and asked the National Portrait Gallery's advice as to who might be a good candidate, for obviously such a prestigious commission. And I think they presented him with a selection of about 5 or 6 different artists who had obviously won the BP Portrait Award before, and presented him with an image of each of their works. And of course, the image for mine was the portrait of my mother, which had won the competition the year before. And apparently he saw that photograph and he remembered seeing the portrait of my mother, which was very fresh in his mind. And he said, no, it has to be her. And I think it was because he really loved the painting, but also I think, and he told me when I met him, because it was a painting of an older woman that was painted with a lot of dignity. And because you do see a lot of contemporary paintings of old people, and they're kind of quite destroyed in the painting, aren't they? They're sort of like the harrowing aspects of old age and all of that. And that, he saw that as a painting that was kind of full of dignity and painting somebody in older age, but in a very beautiful way. And so I think he felt safe, as well, that I was going to do a kind portrait of the Queen, or, So then very, very soon after that, we arranged a meeting with him, and he was a completely lovely and delightful person. And we met at the Foreign Office with the person from the National Portrait Gallery who he'd had this exchange with. She came with me. And we would discuss ideas for the portrait. And I was rather expecting them to want a kind of grandiose portrait of the Queen with all her kind of regalia, crown, the classical kind of regal portrait that you see, which is kind of not really my thing. I wouldn't have said no to it, but I was slightly worried that that's what they wanted. But in fact, no, he wanted actually quite an intimate portrait of the Queen that kind of represented her human qualities. And I remember very distinctly, he said, when we met, he said, after all, she's the queen, but she's also the nation's grandmother. And he said he wanted me to bring out sort of, that side of her in the portrait, which I thought, well, that's great, because that I actually find much more interesting. So that was the brief, and the size and the composition, all of that was completely down to me. There was no specific requirements in that respect. And then, of course, as I thought about it, I thought, well, how often are you going to have the opportunity to paint the Queen? If you're going to paint the Queen, then of course you want to do a full figure portrait of the Queen, and it has to be quite because the scale of my work is not massive because of the nature of my work. So, the portrait of the Queen at the time was the biggest portrait that I've painted. So then after that, I had various communications with people at the palace about the sittings and how they might happen, and where the room that the sitting will take place could be, and I was allowed, and the sitting was at Windsor Castle. I had 2 sittings in total, both for an hour each, which is, as artists we know, an hour is nothing, but in the Queen's calendar, an hour is a massive. That's granting a massive amount of time, especially given her age, and I think there was the time when she would do subsequent sittings for artists, but that doesn't happen now. So the fact that I got 2 sittings for an hour, I think, was quite generous on their part. But of course, I just went into slight panic mode and thought, what can I do in an hour? I mean, there's no point even pretending you're going to do a drawing or a sketch. That will just be for show. So I thought, I've just got to take as many photographs of her as I can. And I was allowed access to the room beforehand. And the staff were all very, very, really helpful and accommodating. So, I could have gone and seen the room 10 times if I needed to, but actually that wasn't necessary. I just had to see it beforehand to familiarize myself with the lighting and whatever. I could leave all my materials and props there, everything that I needed, so that on the day of the sitting, and I could go obviously ahead of the time on the day of the sitting and have everything set up so that when she walked through that door, there'd be no faffing around with,
go time,
whatever. It would just be, yeah, exactly. And what's really nice is that the sittings are very much treated as a private moment between the artist and the Queen. So you're very much, there are people in the room, clearly, but they're very much in the corner of the room, just keeping an eye out, but you're very much left to your own devices, so you can have a conversation with her, and that's really lovely, actually, because there's a real understanding that part of what makes a good portrait is actually the chemistry between the artist and the sitter. And by chemistry, I don't mean that you have to like each other or you have to, hey, party, really get on. It just means you have to have that. It's a very intimate moment and a very intimate space that always happens between. And she's incredibly, she's the most professional sitter in the world. She's probably the most painted person in the world, if you think about it.
Yeah.
So she's an absolute pro at it. She will do, and she's and there's no ego, and she's very much there to accommodate what you want her to do within that space of time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how it happened. And of course, so that was in July of 2019, and then I asked for a second sitting, which was going to happen sort of in October of that year or after the summer. But then, of course, we were having all that kind of election, proroguing of Parliament, Brexit, all of that so there was a lot going on, and the sitting obviously kept being postponed. So I finally had the second sitting in, I think it was February of the following year. And I was very much at the last stages of the portrait. And it was just before we went into lockdown. I remember that
Wow.
the headline news was that they were building a hospital in Wuhan. So I got there just in time because, any time after that, it wouldn't have happened. And then I had the surreal experience of, painting the portrait of the Queen whilst we were all in deepest lockdown, which was, strange, bizarre.
Just you and the Queen.
But that's just me and the Queen. Exactly.
And for the second sitting, did you have to say, oh, can you make sure she wears the same clothes again, or did that matter to you?
No, because the second sitting was really, for me, was very much just about her face.
Okay.
And I knew that I could feel that time was tight, and they were trying to find that time for the second sit. So I really did not want to be demanding about any of it, which is why I said it doesn't matter where it happens, doesn't matter what she's wearing. I just need, it's just all about her face, you know.
Yeah.
And again, you know, the portrait was not almost finished, but it was very much at the latter stage. And actually, with hindsight, that sitting happened just at the right time, because it was perfect that it happened when the rest of the painting was at a very evolved stage.
Yeah.
Because then I knew exactly what I needed to do, you know, with the portrait.
Yeah. So did you ask her about the crown? You know, was it accurate? Did she watch it?
You're not allowed to share what goes on, what conversations you have.
I'm going to take that as a yes.
So I can't tell you what we spoke about.
Yeah. So then did she get to see it, or did you hear
she has
she
seen
liked
it? We had a virtual unveiling of it at the Foreign Office. And again, this was in July last year. I've completely lost sense of time throughout all of this. It's crazy. In July of last year, we had an unveiling at the Foreign Office, and it was a digital unveiling by Zoom. It wasn't Zoom, but you know, the special Palace digital platform that they have.
Palace Zoom.
Which whatever it is, you know, Royal Zoom. And it was beautifully choreographed by the Foreign Office. And they spent a week preparing for this. I was absolutely mind blown that it was all, you know, and that was all filmed. And of course, it felt to me tragic at the time that she wasn't going to physically see her portrait, because that's classically what happens. And that I couldn't have this moment with her where I could see whether she liked it or not, or, you know. But the flip side of that is, because it was all done digitally and it was all recorded digitally, that became a bit of a coup. So the news of this kind of went all around the world, weirdly. And I got just an insane amount of, especially from Spain, because of course in Spain, I'm the Spanish artist who has painted, you know, the British Queen, which is quite something for them.
Yeah.
So the amount of press attention in Spain was just insane. It was just off the Richter scale, which I'm not complaining about it at all, but it literally, I mean, it just took up about 3 months of my time doing radio interviews, Zoom interviews, you know, and you get to a point where you're answering the same question over and over again, and you start to feel like a fraud, you know, because you're trying to give the answer some kind of emotional, you know, input. But there's hope that they will be, because the portrait is not, because the reception room where the portrait is meant to hang is not finished yet. So, you know, the building works are way behind. So there's hope that when it does get hung in the reception room, there might actually be a physical unveiling that the Queen might be able to attend. So that would be really lovely if that happened, because, you know, Zoom screens are the worst way to see any kind of artwork, you know, so she's seen it, but she hasn't seen it, if you see what I mean. You know, I'm sure she will have been shown good digital images of it and whatever, but
I think if you'd been there in person, because I had Colin Davidson on the podcast and he did a portrait of the Queen as well.
Yes.
And there's a video of her being there at the unveiling in Belfast, and she's such a pro, like you can't tell, like she looks like she really likes it, but you're kind of going, yeah, but does she really like it? Or, you know, she just... Yeah,
you just don't know. She just gives nothing away. She really is, yeah. Diplomacy itself.
Yeah. Okay, so former podcast guest Julian Davis, who's originally English, he lives in America for years, and he's talking about your portrait of Queen Elizabeth. He says, from Aganini to Freud, this poor wee woman has been captured in paint. Lousy inheritance, embarrassing progeny, she's battled on nonetheless. You seem to have caught her stoicism. Was that your intent?
Well, thank you. Well, yes, partly because, as I was saying earlier, the aim for the portrait, for an artist, always when you paint a portrait, you're trying to get into the psyche of the person. You're trying to capture their essence, really, their humanity. And also from the Foreign Office brief, from Sir Simon MacDonald's brief, was that he wanted very much for me to represent her. So I didn't want to paint a portrait of the Queen, which is the Queen, the iconic image, because she has become an iconic image. Everything about her is instantly recognizable, which is actually a really difficult thing when you're painting her as a portrait painter, because you can't avoid that. That has to be in the portrait, but you're fighting that all the time, because if you're not careful, that's all it will be. It will be the postage stamp of the Queen, in whatever setting you've placed her in. So yes, and I mean, she is an incredibly stoic person, and the qualities that struck me about her, and this is something that I caught instantly the first moment that I met her. And she's a tiny person. I'm actually quite tall, so that doesn't help. So the kind of, and she's quite advanced in age now. She's in her mid-90s. She was 94, I think, when I met her. But there's this incredible sense of vital energy around her. So she's a very a very vital person. So you just get that off her the minute you meet her, and very radiant. I mean, I'd almost go so far as to say she has a very powerful aura, which I know sounds like a woo-woo thing, but actually I do think she has a very powerful aura. And that's something that I tried to capture in the portrait, because I thought, well, this is interesting, because it really was the first thing that struck me about her. And I thought, this is interesting because I'm not painting the monarch with the crown and all the regalia and whatever, but I can use this very strong sense that I got of her as having this powerful aura as a regal touch in the portrait, but described in a different way. So I used the element of the gold chair behind her, and the kind of whiteness of her hair, which is again such an iconic thing about her, is her white hair, as to create a sense of light around her head, almost like a halo of light in the kind of traditional aura kind of way. But yes, so she's incredibly vital, and she struck me as being incredibly shrewd. So she literally stood there and kind of took me in for a good half a minute before she then sort of beamed and put her hand out and said, "Nice to meet you." But yeah, it was a real sense of clocking me, which I thought, this is very interesting. And actually, I thought a real compliment in a way, because she has met 1,000,001 people, and I'm just one of the many, so to take that time to actually, for her to even bother to wonder what she thinks of you, if you see what I mean,
Yes, yeah.
But then she also struck me as a very incredibly down-to-earth person. So it very much feet on the ground, and yes, stoicism, I would say, is very much part of the kind of qualities that I sensed about her. It's interesting how we get such a strong impression of somebody on first meeting, isn't it? That kind of, and that only happens in the physical space somehow, because maybe that's the way we've evolved to sense other people. But it's amazing how much we read about somebody in those kind of first seconds of meeting them, and then when you get to know them better, you'll make all sorts of other you'll come to all sorts of other conclusions about them. And then when you've known them for an awfully long time, you realize that first impression you had is actually very true.
Yeah.
And it kind of represents a very true essence of them, you know.
Yeah, there's loads of studies on that, of how fast we do it. It's seconds. It really is. It's very few seconds. I think it's 2 seconds. We kind of know.
Yeah.
Within 2 seconds. Okay. Kylie McKay in Australia says, do you have off days or weeks? And if you do, how do you push through to maintain the quality in the intricate details of your paintings?
Yes, I definitely have off days, weeks and months even. Yeah, I mean, actually, the first thing I think you have to learn as an artist is discipline, because otherwise you will get zilch done. There's nobody telling you when to clock on or when to clock off. There's nobody telling you how many days a week you have to work. So you have to structure your own time, which is a very dangerous thing. So you have to be really disciplined and honest with yourself, I think, about the amount of time you're putting into your work. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't allow yourself time off. I think time off is vital. And, you know, there'll be times when that time off is a season off or half a year off, not literally off the tip, but, you know, you can have periods when you're working very effectively, and then you'll have other periods where you're really not working effectively for whatever reasons. Might be because you've got a lot of other stuff going on in your life, or you've just hit a bit of a trough inspirationally and creatively and whatever. And that's fine. That happens. It's an organic process, but be honest with yourself about the fact that it's happening. And how do I plow through, I think was the question.
Yeah.
I mean, occasionally, if I'm really feeling like, oh God, I just really don't want to be in the studio today, occasionally I will literally just take myself off for the day. And I won't do anything more adventurous than maybe go to a museum, see an exhibition, go and see my favorite paintings in a national gallery, whatever, sit in a cafe, watch the world go by. But that's enough. Often that's enough, and it kind of feeds me and it re-inspires me. Or I'll go to a bookshop and I'll find a book that I haven't seen before with a couple of images in it that I think, oh God, that's amazing, that's amazing. I'll bring it home. I'll do nothing with it. But it's that sense of a kind of whole world being out. Because, you know, I think the thing is for artists that we have to work in complete isolation. It's the only way the work gets done. And actually, I'm very good at that. I love being in my own space, and I love being in my own company. I love being in my own headspace. But you do need to come up for air from time to time, because that can be, it's hard to sustain that by yourself. It's hard to sustain that sort of sense of being alive and connected and inspired. You know, you sometimes need a bit of outside input, and that will be different for some people. Might need to go out and rave in a nightclub or party, or just see a whole bunch of friends, or whatever works for you is totally fine. But in terms of kind of plowing through with the work, you just have to plow through with the work, I'm afraid, even on those shitty days when you really do. Because if every time you feel like, you give in to that, you'll spend 5 days in the studio a year. Because, you know, most days you don't go into the studio singing zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay. Most days you go into the studio thinking, oh, God, you know, I've got to get this bit done before I get to the fun bit, which happens, you know, 2 weeks down the line. Yeah. And a lot of it is just work. I mean, at the end of the day, it is just work. It's like anybody else clocking in at work. You just have to turn up and do it.
Yeah. As
you said, like Hemingway said, you have to bleed over the keyboard. So you have to bleed over your brushes.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. I can't remember who I was talking to. I think it was Alpay FA, and he was saying that within that discipline of showing up, there's also a time. There's some days when you know it's all is good. Actually, I don't think it was Alpay. All is well, and then there are other days when it's like, yeah, today's a day for cleaning brushes, cleaning the studio, doing stuff, because I'm probably going to wreck it if I go near. I'm just not in the right space, but I'm going to the studio and I'm going to do something.
Yeah. No, it's true. And I spend a lot of time procrastinating. And a lot of that can be tidying up, making a coffee, all of that stuff. But I've come to terms with the fact that that's part of my process. That's part of my tuning into the day. And if a day has got to 4:00 in the afternoon and I'm still procrastinating and tuning in, then I'll be very honest with myself and say, okay, today's not the day when you're going to do anything really groundbreaking. So, you know, just catch up with emails or do all the other stuff that we all need to do to keep life on an even keel. So, I mean, it's sometimes I think, God, it's shocking if you were to brutally write down the minutes and the hours. It's shocking actually how little time you spend painting and how much time you spend on peripheral stuff. that can be, I mean, email is a tyranny for all of us. We've created a world now where our time is just, it's like we've got 10 sockets all over us. And there are all these things plugging in all the time that are sapping our energy and our attention. And the other thing that does that is social media, of course. I mean, how many hours do we all spend not just putting stuff on our own Instagram or whatever, but being distracted by all the stuff that you see on it. I love it and hate it in equal measure, because I see a lot of stuff that's very inspiring and that can open up ideas for me. But I'm also very aware that it can be a very addictive thing, you know. And we get a text message here and we get an email pop up there, and we, you know, so you have to be very, some people are very disciplined about switching everything off and just being with ease, or I'm not. I kind of keep stuff on and I respond to stuff, which I realize is probably not the best way to do it. But yeah, just be brutally honest with yourself about, and also just actually come to, so I came to terms with this years and years ago. I'm not a morning person. Mornings are a disaster for me, but I get very productive at night. So mornings for me are about having a slow breakfast, catching up with the news, you know, engaging with the day, emails that need to get done in the morning, whatever. And then it will be sort of after lunchtime that I'll really start to kind of engage with the work. And then I can happily, if I have to, I can happily paint till midnight. I'm very, very happy. Yeah, I'll break to eat, but I'm just very happy. I get very creative at night. And I'm Spanish, so we're very nocturnal people anyway. We're very kind of become awake at night. So, you know, but other people are the opposite. You know, I have friends who get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, which is just an unknown universe to me, and get everything done in the morning, and then they crash in the afternoon. So yeah, just follow your own biorhythms. I think that's very important too.
Yeah. Tony Lombardo in New York says, how much time do you spend preparing a painting in terms of developing the idea, doing research, working out composition, gathering references, etc.?
A long time. And that, of course, yeah. And no, a long time, I think, by most people's standards. But obviously that will vary depending on the nature of the painting and the composition of the painting. So, for example, for portraits, probably not as long as I would for other types of painting, because a portrait, in a sense, already dictates to you half of the composition is already dictated by the fact that you're painting a person, and that will be either a 3/4 pose or a 4-figure pose, seated, or whatever it might be. But even within that, there are so many opportunities for the kind of peripheral aspects of the composition. So yeah, and what I tend to do is I tend to take the idea for a walk. So I'll know that the portrait, and I'll even do this for commission portraits. I know that the portrait has to be a certain format and a certain, but I think, yeah, but actually what would it look like if it were just, you know, a different format and this sort of size? And I know that's going nowhere in terms of the kind of finished product. But again, it's what I was saying earlier, that sometimes going tangentially off in a different direction opens up an idea that you might not have had. Because otherwise your idea with figurative painting, it can all become very linear if you're not careful. It can all be, oh, I'm painting somebody sitting on a chair with a cup of tea, and that's it. Whereas I think if you kind of expand that sideways and upwards and downwards and whatever, that chair can become something else, or that chair can be positioned in a way that you wouldn't have thought. That cup of tea can actually be a metaphor for something. You know, you can bring other threads into it that might not be immediately obvious in the end painting, but they'll have somehow have changed the chemical nature of that painting. If for want of a better way of saying it, they'll have changed the mood of the painting. So yeah, the whole process of working out, gathering, exploring ideas can be very, very convoluted and very long, and I love it. which is why I allow it to be I mean, if I didn't love it, I wouldn't indulge it to that degree. But I absolutely love it. That's the stage of the work that I like the most, because all the potential is there. It feels like there's an infinite potential for the ways that any work could go. And then, yes, sometimes I gather an obsessive amount of source material, like I'll, especially with paintings where I've sort of invented, I'm trying to think of an example to illustrate this. When have I invented an object recently in a painting? So for the portrait of the Queen, for example. So there's a teacup on the table next to her. And there was a teacup there in the room, which I photographed exquisitely from many different angles and beautifully, and got the lighting all right. And then, because I wanted to add a slightly surreal element into the painting, but, it was a portrait of the Queen, so I had to be careful how outrageous, I couldn't go too outrageous with this. And it was for the Foreign Office, so I was very conscious.
Of blood.
So I felt slightly kind of constrained by that. But because when I was painting the portrait, I had, especially, I started with a carpet with that painting of the Queen, because I always set the background in first, because that's the world that the figure inhabits. So until I get some sense of the background, the tonality of it, whatever, I feel that I can't approach the figure. And I love pattern and I love perspective, so the carpet was a gift. So I just got happily painting the carpet for endless weeks. And I kept getting Holbein's ambassadors coming into my mind all the time that I was painting the carpet. And I think because it's one of my favorite paintings, I think it's just a masterpiece. I love Holbein anyway. He's probably my favorite portrait painter. But there's that sense of, in his painting of the ambassadors, he set the stage with that kind of tiled floor. And I felt that that's kind of what I was doing with my portrait of the Queen. I was setting the stage with the carpet. And and also there's something very regal about Holbein's painting of the ambassadors. And, anyway, that painting kept coming into my mind, and I'd been thinking about, and I was tempted to distort some of the pattern in the carpet to put some kind of coded message in it. But that's the thing, and I had various ideas which I shall not share.
I was going to ask you, if you lean down in the corner of this portrait.
Well, no, but I didn't dare, because they were all kind of quite political, and I thought, no, I just can't possibly go there, But then, of course, I started to think, well, and I knew that the teacup was going to somehow change and morph into something else at some stage, but I'd kind of left that on the back burner, as it were. So the teacup was there in the composition, didn't quite know what I was going to do with it, but I knew something interesting. And then, of course, I was thinking about the anamorphic skull in Holbein's painting. And I suddenly thought, gosh, wouldn't it be interesting if instead of a touch of surrealism in the work somehow, I went for a touch of anamorphism somewhere, because it's something that's always fascinated me. It's a kind of tangential aspect of perspective. And I don't know if you've seen those anamorphic images where it's a kind of distorted image on a table surface, and then there's a cylindrical object with a reflective surface in the middle of the table. And it's only when the distorted image is reflected on the cylinder do you see what it is. It was a kind of fashion, So I thought, I could do that in the teacup and have a pattern in the saucer that's reflected into the gold bowl of the teacup. And that set me on a complete, so that's, anyway, that was to illustrate my point, that sometimes when I invent an object in a painting, that can be a very wonderfully, exquisitely distracting moment where I'll suddenly, I Googled every possible image on anamorphic drawings, because I thought, well, okay, I've seen these things, but how the hell does it work? I know it's perspective, but it's a very quirky...
You could have called me. I've got a Damien Hirst one from the Tate. I don't know if you ever saw one. Yeah, no. I mean, it was in the gift shop, right? But it's it's a little... It's a silver... It's like one of those little espresso cups. And on the saucer is a anamorphic skull that when you look in the reflection of it on the cup, it's perfect.
Oh, fantastic. I didn't realize I hadn't seen this. But anyway, so I was looking at the kind of, 18th, 17th century ones, 16th century ones. Anyway, so that had to all be invented. And then, of course, I was sort of, I had to go off and find, because the teacup didn't have a gold enameled exterior like it has in my painting. It had a very kind of Victorian little flowery pattern on it, which was very lovely. But, I had to go off and find myself a kind of gold teacup that vaguely resembled that one in shape, because I had to try this out and make sure that it worked, and stick a pattern onto a saucer that was distorted and see more or less how it would. Because one thing is to invent something, another thing is to paint it convincingly. So I had to have some kind of visual reference to this, but then adjust the pattern accordingly. And anyway, that was all that, that's kind of, that's sort of in answer to the question that, yes, it can get very, very involved depending on the painting. The whole kind of...
So what did you put in the cup? What was the reflection?
Oh, yes. So it was the insignia associated with the Foreign Office, which is the Order of St. Michael and St. George.
And did
which
they
is,
cop that?
Yeah, and in fact, it was... Yeah, they did. Well, in fact, I discussed it with Sir Simon MacDonald because, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't... Initially I thought, well, what can I have in this saucer? That maybe a crown or something, because I thought that would be rather nice if a crown is reflected. And then he came up with the idea. He said, well, actually, because the painting's for the Foreign Office, it might be rather nice to have the insignia associated with the Foreign Office. We just thought actually was a very neat, because there is now a kind of visual reference in the painting to the place that it was commissioned for, which I like. I like that. I think that's a rather nice touch. Yeah. So that's what I mean. You just don't know where ideas are going to take you. They're kind of organic, and that's very exciting.
So just in case Tony wants specifics, are we talking months or years for the research and all the, to do with his question about how long does it take?
No, I think, yes, well, for the Queen, obviously I went to the nth degree for that painting, but I spent probably, I'm really plucking this out of the air, but it feels to me like I spent about 3 months working out composition ideas and the layout drawings. So I came up with 2 layout drawings, incredibly similar to each other, to present to Sir Simon. But he didn't want to see any drawing. He would have been quite happy for me to just crack on and, but this is how I like to work. And I do like to show a drawing to the client so that they have an idea of where the painting is going. I think that's the right thing to do. So anyway, all of that took about 3 months. And then in between that, the little distraction with the little anamorphic teacup, that was probably a good couple of weeks. Just gathering the information for the teacup and trying it out and making sure it would work. That was at the latter stages of the painting. There's another painting that I painted, I think it's one of the ones you posted on your Instagram. It's called The Heavens. And it's a painting that's about 20 years old now. And it's a similar proportion to the portrait of the Queen, give or take a couple of centimeters. And that painting was... a really kind of fantastical still life composition. And I set that up in my studio at the time in front of me. Some of the objects in the painting I didn't have. So the little marble atlas figure that's holding up the whole kind of celestial chart and all of that. Clearly I didn't have an exquisite Renaissance marble, little cherub hanging around in my studio. So that was done from photographic references. But all the other objects in the painting I either had or I constructed. So there's a lot of little constructed objects in that painting. Even the gravel on the ground, that was all in the studio, the twigs, the whole shebang. It was like a little theatre set that I constructed that I then spotlit. And that painting from start to finish took about a year. But I think at least 4 months of that was constructing the setup. And again, that started. So that actually, this is a very good illustration to answer the question. So that painting started with an idea that I'd been looking at celestial charts, kind of antique celestial charts, which are incredibly beautiful and fantastical and kind of very whimsical, and I love them. And I'd been sort of going off I was doing some research on images at the British Library by St Pancras Station. And I discovered in the British Library these celestial charts by John Bevis, which are actually the most beautiful ones that I've ever seen. I think they were printed in 1780 something or other. And they had one of the original books in the British Library, and they did the kind of these Xerox scans of it for me, which was really, really kind of them. And this is when I bought my first ever computer, which happened to be a Mac, an Apple computer. I'd never even sent an email, by the way. This was 2001 or 2000 when I started this painting. I was I think very few people were using, so anyway, I wanted to collate these Xerox scans to create an orange segment style map of the universe, because each of these scans represented one of the constellations, and they were all at a slightly different scale. But you knew somehow that if you kind of click them all together like a jigsaw puzzle, they would form a kind of a sphere, basically. So that's why I got this Apple computer, which had a very rudimentary version of Photoshop. I think it was called Photoshop Elements or whatever. And that was kind of my first step. So these Xerox scans, I scanned as JPEGs into the computer, and I collated them all in Photoshop. So I was teaching myself how to use Photoshop and trying to collate. So that all took forever. And then when I finally achieved it, I just felt this incredible sense, like I'd really cracked the code of the universe. That's how it felt. It was such an incredible sense of, achievement. I then printed them out onto blue paper, and that became the celestial chart that you see in the back of the painting. And that was the start of the idea. I didn't know where this was going, by the way. I just knew I wanted to do this. This is like a little challenge that I set myself. And then from that grew the idea for the whole painting. So I thought, well, actually, wouldn't it be, so this can now become the background for a still life where I play around with the kind of, the planets in the solar system and kind of all the mythological associations with them and blah, blah, blah. So that was the genesis for that painting. And then it was trying to find the right props that would represent each planet, constructing the little dodecahedrons and whatever I've got going on in that painting. And and finding the rhythm for the work, which is really important. I mean, the amount of hours I spent tweaking an object, literally moving it like, oh no, just slightly twist. No, it's better that way. Oh no, just back, forth. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, literally you can spend a whole day just tweaking the position of an object when your painting still lies. It's a very obsessive but fun process. So that was, that's the most involved. I think that's been the most involved painting in terms of the kind of preparation and the amount of work that goes into it, in a very different way to the Portrait of the Queen, which is very much about resolving the composition on paper, as it were. That was resolving the composition physically in front of me.
Yeah, she's no interest in star charts as well, I could tell you. Would have been wasting your time there. Lydia Martin in Boston says, how many paintings do you produce a year? Your paintings are so highly detailed and appear to have many layers applied. Well, yes. So how many paintings do you produce a year?
Not many, sadly. I mean, it really depends on the scale of the work. But at the moment, it's working out at about 2 paintings a year, which is nothing. But that would include a painting the size of the Queen's, which is at least 6 months' work for me to paint something like that. So then that allows a period of postpartum exhaustion before you kind of engaged with another painting, which would be slightly smaller maybe, But at the moment, I mean, when I was, I started working with galleries very, very early on. And I started working, kind of falling into that pattern where I was working towards exhibitions. So I was working with a gallery in London, I was working with a gallery in Paris. And again, I'm going back to the period of the kind of the heavens and this kind of magical still life compositions that I used to paint before I got onto portraiture. And every 2 or 3 years, I'd have a solo exhibition in one of these galleries. And the standard thing was that they would always need about 15 works. To put on a solo show would be about 15 works. And maybe 2 of those works could be previous works from a previous exhibition that hadn't sold, but generally they wanted fresh So there was a time when I was producing 15 works in about 2 years. And I think back and I think, how on earth did I ever do that? And the answer is that I was 20 years younger, which helps, but I was literally painting till about 3 or 4 o'clock every morning, 7 days a week. Not for the entire of the 2 year, but, towards the latter stages when the pressure was on. And I had a very clear idea of what quite a lot of those works would be, so I had an idea 5-7 paintings ahead. I knew what they were going to be because there were all these ideas that were really crashing into my mind at the time. And each painting bred the ideas for the next one. So it was a really, really intensely creative and productive period. But, I couldn't do that now. I couldn't sustain that now. It would totally burn me out.
Yeah.
But I did it. God knows how. But yeah, I've slowed down. But then my paintings have become more involved in a different way. Yeah, and my technique has become more involved as well. I do a lot more glazing now than I was doing then, and that's a slow process.
Yeah. And are you always just working on one, like painting at a time? Or do you have a few on the go to allow for drying times and all that kind of thing?
No, I basically just work on one painting at a time because there's so much detail in my work. There's always the opportunity to move to a different area of the painting whilst that other area is drying.
Yeah, right.
And because I work with this medium that has a bit of dama varnish in it, it does encourage the drying of the layers. Yeah. So I find that within tops 3 days or whatever, I can go back. Most of the time I can paint from one day to the next, layer upon layer. But some pigments do take a lot longer to dry than others. But yeah, it's never a problem. So there's always work to be done on one painting. I never hit a dry patch.
Okay. Okay, this is an odd kind of question, but here we go. Belinda Tessick in London says, when faced with making a big decision, how do you decide what's the right thing to do? P.S. Please keep up the outstanding work. So, a bit of life coaching there.
I was going to say that question could apply to life, couldn't it?
Yeah.
When facing a big decision, how do you decide
what is the right thing to do?
Gosh, okay. I'm going to take this seriously. So this is, I think instinct plays a huge part in the kind of decision-making process for me. So I'm quite a cerebral person, and I like bringing my brain and my logic process into, I love resolving perspective, the whole anamorphism, all of that is all kind of very brainy stuff, which I love to do. But ultimately, it's my gut that tells me whether something's working or not. And that's the ultimate decider of what's going to work and what's not going to work. So I have very interesting conversations with a friend of mine who's an author, actually. She was trained as an architect, but she's now an author. And we talk quite a lot about the creative process, which is not something that you can talk about with many people, actually, in life, as you probably know. She talks about the writing process and I talk about the painting process. And of course, there are similarities and there are differences between the two of them. But we discuss this idea of culling your babies. So, often you'll have during the kind of ideas process and you get excited by lots of ideas and you want to throw them all into a work. But then you have to do some editing out because, they're all going to kind of crash against each other. It's going to be a car crash, the painting. And you have to decide which ideas work sympathetically with others and which are sort of, taking up unnecessary space, as it were. And that for me happens all very, very instinctively. And I think I'm very aware now. I think all of this, if we'd had this interview 20 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to explain half of this kind of stuff to you, because I was doing it, but without really understanding what it was that I was doing. But because I've had to talk about my work quite a lot recently, and about the creative process quite a lot recently. And of course, it's an impossible thing to talk about because it is all pretty non-verbal. But nonetheless, it's interesting to verbalize the creative process because it makes you aware of what you're doing in a way that you're not necessarily. So anyway, this is all just leading up to the fact that I think I can do a switch in my mind between my logical brain and my instinctual brain. And I don't know, couldn't even tell you what the instinctual brain is, but I think it's probably the brain that's involved with emotional intelligence and all other sort of things. And I'm very aware of when I'm doing it. So I let the logical bit come out and play, and all its kind of fun stuff and all its clever stuff and all that kind of, and then I'll switch into kind of what feels right and what doesn't feel right, and what and I'll let that be the ultimate judger of how the painting needs to go forward. And I often do that actually when a work is finished, because I often don't want to analyze too much what it is that I'm doing whilst I'm doing it. And then I finish the work, and then I let it be for a while, and then I come back to it and I look at it, and then I start to actually decode it, which is interesting because it was me that coded it in the first place, but I wasn't aware what the coding was. But it's interesting to sort of decode it. That's actually quite I think that's quite a useful thing to do as an artist, because I think a lot of the time we're not actually aware. I think I said this earlier, we're not really aware why we do what we do. And I think maybe you don't want to be too consciously aware of it, but I think a bit of awareness is a powerful tool to have, because then you can steer that a little bit. So yeah, I mean, that probably answered the question in a very complex way. I mean, it's an impossible question to answer, of course, but yeah, I know instinctively, basically, when whatever the question was, when something is
what the right thing to do is,
what the right thing to do is,
very good. My tip, Belinda, you didn't ask me, but I'm going to throw it in anyway, is to toss a coin. This is for bigger stuff, for life stuff, because when you toss a coin, you very quickly see how you really feel. Like, should I take that job or not? I'm going to toss a coin for it. And before tossing the coin, you're completely in your mind undecided. But as soon as it's heads or tails and it's like, no, don't take that job, or do take that job, if you can catch it, you'll catch yourself going, oh, I really wanted to take the job.
Yeah.
And then you know how you really feel about it. So I recommend tossing a coin. Salinion on Instagram, this is another strange question, feel free not to answer it, says, oh, eternal dear artist, describe what you know about creativity for our awareness. Thank you for the unique creations you make. Now, you've said a lot about creativity already, so if there's anything else you want to add that's prompted by that question.
Well, I would just sort of almost do a summary of what I was saying earlier, which is I think that creativity is where our conscious mind meets our unconscious mind. That's the best way I can describe it. And some kind of synergy happens. So, yeah. And okay. I could, we could say all sorts of stuff about the unconscious mind, but maybe, let's not, because we'd be here for hours. But yeah.
All right. What's the last piece of art you bought?
Oh gosh. I don't buy very much art, which is a terrible confession for an artist. Although I've got someone in mind whose work I do want to buy. probably more than one person in mind, and I should just go ahead and do it. And I'll name him. Actually, I think he's a brilliant artist. He's called Lewis Chamberlain, and he does the most exquisite drawings that have all of those things that I was talking about earlier. They just take you completely into another weird, slightly spooky, surreal, magical world. So I want to buy one of his drawings, actually, and I should just get in touch with him now that I've verbalized that thought.
No. Well, look, he's a regular listener. He's going to be in touch now.
I buy a lot of objects and quirky objects and little artifacts that I'm actually kind of almost more drawn to objects than I am to paintings. That sounds like a very weird thing to say, but I do collect a huge amount. I mean, I've sort of slightly toned it down now, but I went through a phase of collecting a lot of quirky little objects, a lot of which have ended up in my paintings down the years. I think that's mostly what I've bought. And I think if I had serious money where I could indulge proper buying, I'd probably buy antiquities. But I'd need serious money for, I'd buy some contemporary art too. But I think my parents had an amazing collection of Spanish church statuary. Where in Spain they're called tallas, which they'd collected ever since they met each other in Spain, and a lot of them were quite damaged. During the Civil War in Spain, a lot of churches kind of got ransacked, and a lot of this stuff would just sort of crop up in flea markets and sort of antique shops, over the years. I mean, not now. Now it's very valued and precious, and you wouldn't be allowed to take it out of the country. But my parents would occasionally find these things, and because they had such a good eye, they would snap them up if they could whenever they found them. And they built up this amazing, really, really lovely collection of church statuary, which it was hanging up all over our home in Spain. And at some point later in life, when we moved here, they had to sell it because they basically ran out of money, and they had to sell it for a song because there wasn't the market for it, which broke their hearts. And we're kind of, it's a bit like the hare with the amber eyes, or whatever. It's that kind of lost family treasure that I fantasized one day I'm going to be invited, because there were 3 Dutch antique merchants that came over and bought this stuff at auction. And I think they made an agreement with each other. They wouldn't outbid each other. So they got everything for reserve price. And I always fantasized one day I'm going to be invited to some swanky dinner in Holland somewhere, and I'll see the Madonna with the golden hair, which was our Madonna, and she'll be there in someone's apartment, and I'll sort of reconnect with her at some stage in my life. But anyway, I mention this because I think these objects had a really profound effect on me growing up, because they are, they're religious objects. So they do have, you don't have to be religious to appreciate this. They have they're very powerful. And I think they're very powerful because of the intent that was put into them when they were created. And possibly they're very powerful because of the energy that they have absorbed throughout the years in the churches that they have inhabited. So there's something, and I think that's why I love objects so much, because I think objects are kind of magical and powerful, and I think you can transmute and transform an ordinary object, and you can turn it into something really quite enigmatic. And that's, I think, what I was trying to do in a lot of my earlier still life paintings. I was trying to create this sense of, I was just trying to make objects enigmatic. I was also trying to say something allegorical about whatever the painting might have been about, but also create this sense of chemistry between objects. It was very interesting that when you place objects together, they talk to each other. They're like little entities. They have a personality, and they affect each other. So it's and I think the more you work with that, the more aware you become of it, And I think it's something that it's just, I mean, you never leave anything behind as an artist, do you? You always take these things onto your next. So, I might be painting portraits now, but that consciousness is still very much within, the portrait paintings that I'm painting now. So I don't know why I started talking about this. It must have been something in relation to the last question you asked, which I can't remember.
I was asking you about the last piece of art you bought. But,
yes. No, I was trying to justify why I love objects. Not that it needs justifying, but I think it's because it's something very powerful from my childhood that kind of really tuned me into that, to the magic quality of objects. Yeah.
Have you? It just occurred to me there when you were talking about the different portraits that you've been doing since you had the BP win, then you had the portrait of the Queen. Have you been approached now for really kind of high profile kind of portraits since that?
Yes and no. I mean, I've done a couple of portraits that I probably shouldn't talk about because they're sort of on the go. But I mean, no Hollywood movie. I mean, not in the way people might imagine. I mean, Brad Pitt hasn't come along and wanted his portrait. Nothing on that kind of level. Not that I'm sure that I would, necessarily want that, but yeah, I've had a lot of inquiries, from various avenues, and I think because I am coming to the realization that I now spend a long time on each painting, and time is precious. I'm not 30 anymore. I'm sort of slightly more discerning about what I take on and what I want to do, or, and that's not to say, oh gosh, I'm just turning them down. Like, I don't mean it in that way at all. It's just that if I'm going to spend half a year on a painting, I want to make sure it's a painting that I want to paint, so, yeah, no, I mean, it's not like the floodgates of, Obama's not knocking at the door wanting his portrait painted, or it's not like that. But then it's been a very strange time as well. We've been through this kind of weird. Well, I mean, weird is a complete understatement, but I think it's I mean, people's attentions have been on existential stuff. It's yeah.
Okay. Okay, this is a new question I've been asking people, and it kind of goes to the why do you paint thing we were talking about. So if you're on a desert island, nobody else, right, and all your food and shelter is taken and you have loads of art materials, but no one's ever going to see it, would you still paint?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Well, would I still paint? I'd still create.
Right.
I don't know if it would necessarily be. I'm not sure painting on a desert island is. I would probably make loads. I know, or not. No, probably I would make loads of stuff. I love making stuff, and a lot of that would be very craft based and trying to make stuff that's very beautiful, and that has a sense of design, and possibly paint as well. But I think probably my instinct would be more to make things, because I think on a desert island, that's what you'd want to do. Where would you put your paintings? Hang them on the palm trees. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, I think taking your question in general terms, I would definitely create, make, paint, whatever. And I think that's what would keep me alive and stop me from existential despair, being on a desert island,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. If there was one main underlying theme to all your work, what do you think it would be?
It's a trite word, but I can't think of a better word. A sense of magic, a sense of otherworldliness, a sense of wonder. I don't know if there's a word to describe all those, but I don't want to make paintings that are purely descriptive. I want to make paintings that are kind of magical in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Trevor Thomas on Patreon, thanks for the tea, Trevor, says, what steps should a young artist take in today's art world to earn the opportunities, awards, and success that you've worked for in your own career?
Gosh. If only I knew the answer to that question. It's, another impossible question. I mean, a very valid question, but a very impossible question. What steps should an artist? Well, okay. So apart from becoming the best artist you can possibly be, which I think is the only point of being an artist, by the way, is to try and be the best version of yourself that you can be through your work. And then if you feel you're doing that and that you're at that level and that your work is valid and worth it, I would say that there's now a huge opportunity. There are so many open competitions out there that artists can enter. I mean, way more than when I first started out, especially in the UK, I'm sure in America too. So enter as many competitions as you can with your work. It will cost you a tiny bit of money every time you do it, but it's money absolutely well spent. Make sure you target the right competition for you. So, there's no point entering a competition that kind of favors abstract expressionist work if you're a photorealist painter, or there's no point, So do your homework. Get out there and have a look at these exhibitions and see what gets accepted and what doesn't get accepted. But absolutely take a punt every time. Learn how to cope with rejection, because you're going to get it time and time again. Even as a successful artist, you will experience rejection, and you have to, and it's painful every time for all of us, but you have to, don't let the fear of rejection stop you from trying, opportunities. There are plenty of opportunities out there. I think there can be a lot of fear about entering your work. I mean, obviously, get your work out there on. I mean, I have a complete love-hate relationship with social media platforms, and I'm very new to them. But it's undeniable that they're completely necessary for contemporary artists, and especially Instagram. So get yourself out there, get your work seen. It depends at what stage you're at. If you're at the if you're very much at the beginning stage of exploring being an artist and find out what you're about, and don't desperately try and find a gallery. I think that would be actually quite a destructive thing to do. I think you need to give yourself space to evolve as an artist before. I think the whole gallery scene is changing anyway before our very eyes. The whole dynamic between the power that galleries have over an artist's career has shifted enormously. The whole dynamic between artists and galleries is shifting, and it's all a work in progress, and God knows where we're going to be in 5 years' time. And I'm not saying that as a kind of anti-gallery thing. I think art galleries are fantastic, and I've worked with many galleries, but it's undeniable that they're not as necessary for an artist's career as they once were. So don't think that being with a gallery is the be-all and end-all. And certainly if you're at the early stages of exploring being an artist, whatever that means, give yourself the time and the breathing space to do that. Nothing comes quickly. Again, we live in a culture where we're very much kind of being educated into expecting instant results for everything. And that's actually, I would say, art is the antithesis of that. Art is a lifetime relationship. If you're serious about being an artist, it's going to be a lifetime relationship, and it will evolve. And you will have happy times, and you will have disastrous times as an artist, and that's all part of the, all part of the kind of magic landscape of it. What was the question again? Sorry, do you mind? I just want to make sure I've answered it properly.
young artists in today's art world earn the opportunities, awards, and successes that you've worked for in your own. So I think you've covered it.
Yeah. So there are plenty of opportunities out there and exhibitions that you can enter your work into, but nothing happens without the work. Yeah. And by that, I mean the work has to be good. It has to be as good as you can possibly make it. So that's got to be your number one emphasis and your number one goal, is to put all your focus into your work. Those opportunities will be out there the minute you raise your head. So you don't, the focus is the work always.
Very good. What sort of price range are your paintings selling for these days?
Quite varied. I mean, they're in the thousands because I spend so much time on them. So they'll be anywhere between. So the most expensive painting I sold is 80,000, which is a lot.
That's pounds sterling, if you're listening, I'm guessing.
Pounds sterling, yeah. And a smaller oil painting would be about 10,000, and then anything between, yeah.
Okay. Do you have a big art dream you'd like to achieve before you die?
Gosh. I have lots of ideas that I want to paint and express before I die. Gosh, a big art dream.
Look, you don't have to be embarrassed. You can say Elton John, that you want to paint a portrait of Elton John. That's fine. No one's going to judge you.
No, actually, I don't have any. I don't have any desire to paint any particular individual. And I know the idea of painting famous people seems to be what's going to make you as an artist, but I think painting a famous person can be a poison chalice in many ways, because you have to get beyond that veneer. It's very hard to paint somebody that there's that whole kind of baggage of fame around them, because most people that will look at the work will never see beyond that. Will never actually see the quality of the painting, because they'll get very stuck on the fact that they're looking at a portrait of Elton John, and it won't go beyond that for them. So that it can be almost a barrier, actually. So yeah, of course, it's kudos as an artist to paint somebody famous, but it's not necessarily going to be your best work. If you get to paint someone famous and it is your best work, then amazing, But so, I really don't have any kind of particular desire to paint anybody really famous. I have ideas that I want to explore. I have ideas that I want to manifest. That are quite, for absolute ages, I've been wanting to paint a painting of Adam and Eve, but in very much my own way. It's something and very almost life size, very big painting. I see it. I see various different versions of it, and I've been seeing it for years. But it's something that I would almost have to. I would have to put a year aside to do it in the way that I want to do it, and to kind of, do it with any sense of to give it justice. Basically, I would have to put a year aside, and I have a couple of other ideas like that I want to. So yeah, I think that's my biggest kind of artist dream, really, is to find the time that I can do these works, because I know they're going to be good works, and I'm not saying that as an egomaniac. I just know that, because they're ideas that have been obsessing me for a long time.
Yeah.
And I think it would be tragic if I didn't get around to doing them.
Yeah. Are you like, with what we were talking about with galleries changing and social media, more contact with collectors, like, do you know your collectors now? Like, would it be a case of one of your collectors is listening to this and going, I want to, I'll be the patron for that painting. I want to see that painting. Like, do you know them well enough?
I know some of the people that buy my work. Yes, I do. Not everybody, because I did sell an awful lot of work through galleries at a time when galleries, and still now galleries are not very happy to let you know who's bought, because that's their cachet, is that they have their clients. And so there's a whole raft of work of mine out there. I have no idea who's bought it, which actually feels quite sad. But yeah, and obviously with portrait commissions, you get to know the people very well, obviously, because you're painting them directly. Yeah, and I do know where a few of my paintings have gone, and that's nice. And I've been in touch with a few clients, and I've borrowed some of those works back to put into exhibitions, which is also nice. So there's a relationship there. It would be amazing if somebody got it into their head that they wanted to facilitate me painting Adam and Eve, then bring it on. That would be fantastic. Yeah.
Well, look, I know the Queen listens to this podcast regularly. She's always emailing me. So don't be surprised if you get a letter from the palace.
Is she buying you cups of tea, John? Is she buying you cups of tea? That's what I want to know.
No, she's not. I mean, I don't like to hassle her about it, but it's a bit rude. Okay, right. I've got to my last question. I ask this to everybody who comes on the podcast. If there's one thing you could pass on to future generations, what would it be? And it doesn't have to be about art.
To future generations. Okay, I mean, this is a very general thing to say, but I think for me, probably the most, just to hang on to the power of your imagination and to believe in it, to follow it, because that's where it all happens. That's where it's all at. I think that's what makes us human, the ability to imagine, the ability to visualize, the ability to manifest. So tap into that all the time, as much as you can. Feed that, keep that inspired, become a visionary in the best sense of the word, in small ways and in big ways if you can, because I think that's what the world needs. I think that's what humanity needs. It needs, it needs dreamers and visionaries, and yeah.
Beautiful.
That would be my message.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, so where can people find you? What's your website?
So my website is my name, which is miriamescofet.com, all one word. Not the .com bit, obviously.
Yeah, I will put links to all this, but just sometimes people don't want to go to the show notes. And on Instagram, I think, just wondering if it's Miriam Escofet or Miriam Escofet Artist. I should know, but let me just check. It is Miriam.escofet. Escofet.artist.
Artist.
So that's Miriam.escofet.artist.
Artist.
Yeah.
That's me.
And then you're on Facebook as well. I think you're on Twitter, are you? Or are you active on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter, and I'm on I basically, whatever I post on Instagram, I tend to repost on Facebook, and I do a mini version of it on Twitter. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, if you want to just stay to one platform, Instagram would be it. Facebook is good when you want to link to stuff that you can't do on Instagram, obviously. But yeah, and I think Facebook is similar. I think I'm miriam.escofet.artist, I think.
Well, it's kind of easier on Facebook. You can search easier.
That's true, but I have one of those public. I didn't know what I was doing so I have two pages. One which I don't use, which is it's Miriam Escofet, but there are two pages. One which is pretty dormant, so don't go to that one, and one which has got lots of stuff on it, which is the one I use, which is a public page.
Yeah.
And then Twitter again is what's Twitter? It's Twitter is Miriam Escofet. No, at Escofet Miriam. Okay. I guess Miriam Escofet must have been taken up by someone else.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's been lovely chatting with you. I really like your work. I like both. I like the portraits and I like the still life and the other work as well. They seem to go together. To me, they're almost like two expressions of the same kind of inquiry, like the still lifes and the surrealist kind of aspect, but is one part of it. But there's an underlying kind of not exploration, but a revelation of that kind of mystery that you were talking about, that kind of magical side of life. And then the portraits have that as well, but it's kind of like grounded in a human being. So almost like the portraits are like the still lifes, but just with the human being instead of the objects. But there's still the same kind of energy. And in a way, the still lifes are those other, the paintings that are not portraits, let's call them that, seem to be more of a kind of like slightly intellectual kind of, it's almost like your thoughts. They look like a kind of a picture of your thoughts. And then the portraits are like that whole idea grounded in a person with humanity and love. And so the two kind of are together for me. They're not kind of like, oh, there's the portraiture and then there's the other kind of painting. They're kind of both aspects of the same thing. Technically, they're fantastic. But what's behind them, I think, is what I really like about them. There's sort of this kind of spiritual dimension, energetic dimension, sort of vitality across the whole, all your work. It's brilliant,
Thank you so much, John. That's lovely. I might write that down. Stick it on my stick it on my bio. It's a lovely description of the work. Thank you. And it's been a pleasure chatting with you. And I do listen to your podcasts and I really enjoy them.
Oh,
so thank you for doing all this work.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. So I keep in touch with everybody. So I'm sure we'll keep in touch for Skype. Not Skype. It's not Skype anymore. No one's using Skype anymore. Zoom, tea or coffee or whatever. But for now, we'll say goodbye.
Thank you very much, John, and goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
I've never felt this good in my entire life. Make me some spaghetti.
Actually, I'd prefer a cup of tea. A cup of tea would be lovely. So yeah, just a little reminder, mainly because every second or third person who becomes a patron has got in touch with me and said, you know what, I've been listening to your podcast for ages and I didn't become a patron, not because I don't have the money, not because I don't think it's great, I just didn't get around to it. So this is a little friendly reminder that if you'd like to be a patron, you'd like to buy me a cup of tea, go to patreon.com/John Dalton, gently does it, all one word, or follow the link in the show notes to become a patron. I would really appreciate it if you could do that, particularly if you've been meaning to and you just haven't got around to it. It would be great. It would mean a lot to me. All right. Thank you. Bye.
We are the Argyle Pimps. So buy us a drink. We're better than you thought, but not as good as we think. We are the Argyle Pimps. So buy us a drink. Come on, buy us a drink. Come on, buy us a drink. We are the Argyle Pimps. So buy us a drink. We're better than you thought, but not as good as we think. We are the Argyle Pimps. So buy us a drink. Come on, buy us a drink. Come on.